lot of places to stop. So we successfully made it here with the caravan. Some folks came direct. Others of us drove along the Chico Midway and Chico Highway, which is, I'm always setting it up. And we're going to end up back there. We're going to drive back into Chico on the Midway coming out of the rice basin. So what we're really going to see is this spot. I want to point everyone's attention quickly to Table Mountain. And on the left-hand side, right behind those pine trees, is where the mine was, right? So we're going to talk about the context of this area, Sierra Nevada on that side, Cascade on this side, and then obviously seeing this 1870s material that was washed out of the hills and filled a basin, a creek, in a dry creek basin all the way out 10 or 12 miles almost, out to lumbered rice, way out in the basin, okay? That's all I'm gonna say. Now, I hand you Andrew Conlin, mapper NRCS, who mapped a lot of this along with Dean, as I said earlier. He's gonna give you all the gory details.
All right, welcome to Butte Valley and the land that's missing a lot. Like Garrett said, you're set up, you're looking at the Cascades, generally to the north, and the irregular horizon in the background is the Sierra Nevada rock. That big table there is Table Mountain. That's Lovejoy basalt. That's kind of not either, but it's part of the picture. And then we're going to travel on Durham-Pence Road that way and get in to see some other terrain on the other side of that saddle, some Cretaceous sandstone, some of the Ione, and then some of the, starting talking about the Cherokee Strip, as Garrett said, is coming off the north end of Table Mountain. I want to point out one thing kind of culturally. There's that one forested ridge in the far background. That is Sawmill Peak. That's some ultramafic rock from the Sierra Nevada. Comes to the west branch of Feather River, is right to the west of it, and then Paradise. And just to maybe set the stage, at the base of that is where the Dogtown nugget was found, the 57-pound nugget the size of a loaf of bread. So that sort of sets the stage for what went on here.
What'd you do with it?
I'm looking for a muffin. Okay. All right. We are on this. Have you ever stood on a block diagram? Oh boy, 63 is this block diagram. Okay. We are on the red, and we're standing right about there. And there's that little squiggly blue unit, which is that little bit of a stream terrace inset to the north. So we're on the edge of this red, dropping down the riser to the blues of the stream terrace of Clear Creek. So that's what that blue corridor is coming through. So we're on the edge of the Strat Terrace. The Strat Terrace is kind of this big void where these Tuscan flows used to continue through here. Now they've been removed, and that's a big story that maybe we can all try to tackle together. Regardless, the Tuscan has been eroded away and backfilled with alluvial cap. So thus the Strat Terrace, you have alluvium over bedrock. So this profile, you can see the two materials, the cobbly red alluvium over Tuscan sandstone. Okay, so that sandstone is part of that whole configuration of the Cascade. Here it's been leveled off and backfilled with alluvium, so you have a nice representation of kind of the double footprints of this setting. That's the volcanic sandstones. Okay, so you have mud flows. Often the cap rock or where the cliffs are the lahars, andesitic tuff brushes. And then also part of the Tuscan formation is you have sandstones and even some tuffaceous sandstones. And down in this part of the Tuscan, there's even a lot more of the sandstone component than the lahar component. No, this is Pliocene, volcanic. Oh yeah, sorry. Yes. With some ash, lots of ash in it. Okay. So this is the sandstone that was part of that whole system, but now has been removed, and you're looking at the trace of what has backfilled on top of it. And so up on the summit, or the stable position of the Strat Terrace, you have the mound swell topography. You have vernal pools. There's a couple pools back there. So it's a three-component map unit of a Tuscan, which is I forget if it's probably shallow here, less than 20 inches, and then a Faliger is in the swales. That's even shallower yet in concave positions. And then you also have some smectitic clay bodies scattered around within this surface. So that's the three components. And in the old days, it probably would have been called one and moved on, but we tried to give it a little more nuance here, showing the microtopography and the different soils associated with the microtopography. So that pretty much sets the stage here. You can see the creek is cut down a lower surface into this. You know, you can go on and on. There's discontinuous abruptic clays. There's a discontinuous durapan there, that redder stuff on top of the sandstone. And then you can see here, you don't have those two layers here. So this place has received a lot of history, a lot of dynamics, and this is basically the basic functional concept that we mapped, is this depth and this lithologic discontinuity here.
This is a great kid.
It is. You could play all day looking, this arm to that arm.
So this is the contrast.
Yeah. I think they need a pal.
This is sandstone?
Yes. You gonna keep asking me that, Jennifer?
Yeah, where's our bowl of water to see if it holds together after that?
Right there, Jennifer.
I need to be able to pull it out. It's just, that is pretty coherent.
Some people don't realize
So all the orchards are in this, and their roots reach down to the soil.
And there's a lot of mysterious sediments that have a little millimeter silica cap. That, the whole thing isn't necessarily the durapan, but in a practical sense, it's a root restriction. And a lot of these things, they don't daylight, so they're not really captured in the geologic sense. And there's a lot more discovery that we have up and down the valley of these denser sediments.
There's a big road cut and this big nice area to pull out in. We're going to be able to walk down and look at the deposition, the high energy deposition of the materials that came out of this mine. And Hannah Arid is here. She'll introduce herself to you over there. She's our economic geologist at Chico State. She's going to give you a rundown about placer deposits, that mine, so we can start thinking about how did the material that we're going to be looking at get there, right? And the fact that it's this interesting time zero example, chronosequence type example, where we have a known aged material, known parent material type that's been deposited inside of a different landscape. And we know how long it's been sitting there. So it's a very interesting opportunity to think about soils and land use. So that's all I got to say.
All right, I'm going to do a couple minutes on this whole hill slope profile. This is a classic example. We were just on the summit. The alluvial package is pretty well preserved. We are now on the shoulder. The shoulder is where the erosion is going on. So the package is thinner. It's been washing away, okay? So you can see that little bit of red over the sandstone, and then you go down to the next pit and you don't have any more alluvium. You're just pretty much looking at a little bit of the blood of the alluvium staining the upper soil, and then you're looking at pretty much a sandstone derived profile on this bedrock riser. So thick alluvial cap, thin alluvial cap, no alluvial cap. Hill slope profile, erosion processes, the back wearing of this riser. Make sense?
Yep.
This is what's in the field guide.
And no durapan here.
No, a little manganese cap on top of the sandstone. So this is back wearing, and this is only going to get thinner and then eventually evolve into a Luxev soil, shallow, derived from sandstone. You can even see the reddening decrease in this pit right here. It's going on within feet here.
You might also consider that we're on a very old surface relative to that surface down there. That's going to be a Holocene. You can go from the basic Pleistocene surface here to the Holocene right there. I mean, that's the line. So if you want to go back in time, you have to come uphill, right? Does that make sense for a geologist?
ascendancy.
No, it doesn't. For a geologist, it's the other way. You go down to get to the old stuff. Here, you go up to get to the old stuff. How does that work? Well, think about it. But nevertheless, these alluvial fans, these alluvial deposits from the Holocene are what we farm, grow, we live on, we play soccer on, we put our sewage in. Those things are manageable soils. Up here, I doubt this has ever been plowed. It could well have been plowed. I would say something. This is, you'd all agree that this is an annual grassland, right? Well, no, it's probably a prairie that has an annual grassland imprint on top of it. There are times of the year you go around and look, this is a geophyte grassland or a geophyte prairie. Geophyte meaning a bulbous plant. This is full of brodeas and disticula and dicalostum, what do you say? Anyway, a lot of, I'm not a botanist, so, but a lot of plants up here are perennial plants, including grasses, that are not part of an annual grassland, although these are designated annual grasslands in every manual you see. The ecologists and botanists don't really have the feeling you're getting right now for age of landscape. And in particular, these vegetation complexes, if they've not been totally disturbed, they have been invaded by these annuals. But if you look around, you'll see a huge number of perennials in here. Huge. And in fact, some years, all you see is perennial. Okay? So that's something to think about. These are fairly nutrient poor soils because because they're aged, because they've been leached so well. And so you've got very rich soils down here, and the line between rich and poor is right there. Okay, so just sort of ecological dynamics of these grassland prairie systems. Why are there no trees in this landscape? Another question to ask. And we'll actually get to that after a while on one other stop. Where are the trees? The trees are associated with the riparian corridors, generally. Okay, there are trees associated with old riparian corridors that no longer exist but have deeper soils because they've been hollowed out of this material. So look for those as well. We'll talk about those more as we get up under the mine debris flows.
Beautiful manifestation of that is microtopography right here, right? It's draining off that slope, and there's just a slight concavity there where the stuff's been piling up. What we were hoping to see, what Andrew put me onto initially, is this concept gets amplified in the lower angle drainages, and we're going to see that downstream on the vernal pool surface where the fine materials can flow into these depressions and have time to settle out. Right? These are a little coarser because it's a steeper system, but that same principle we're going to see a couple more times today as we go down the tour. So, anyone else? Otherwise, all right, let's go.
More like slate.
Yeah, a lot of phyllite here.
It's
Yeah.
soft, kind of softer stuff. More silt.
Yeah, probably like quiet water deposits. Maybe in an island or Back Bay.
You need to call it
And the
that.
road starts turning, you know, you're shifting gears in the Sierra Nevada, the irregular topography. Cascade, the roads, you can make them right up the ridges, nice and smooth. Here, it's like Highway 49. You're you know, weaving around due to the irregular, structure of the bedrock. And there's a little ion right back in here, and there's even, I think, a tiny Lovejoy cap up there, again, to try to make this, grandiose story of the Lovejoy used to be here, and now it's, back worn to where it is. But it's left its traces over here.
Is that the same basalt that we have down in Sonora? Or
You guys always call that
temporary?
latite, and I think it's Miocene, and that's when the earth was pumping out a lot of basalt. You know, the Columbia River, all of that.
Some guy, I think, in like 1900 called it latite, and so
it's stuck.
It's stuck, yeah. But in Fresno County, we call it basalt.
Good.
So
Yeah. There's some of the mine cut. Okay, see that creamy pinkish color? That's a good signature of the ion, and you see the black basalt cap on it. So they were blasting away right around the corner, in particular, with 16 cannons and just laying waste to that stuff, and it was coming down to where we're going.
Are there any history, monuments or little museums for
Cherokee does, yeah. If you go up here, and it's an awesome place to go in about late March, April. The wildflowers and the creeks and the waterfalls are just fairyland. And Cherokee's on the way, and they have a little museum and some monuments and even some old buildings. So here's this valley void. That's why Garrett's taking us here. This is the view of this whole setting. There's the mine of the redeposits. The gold mine was up there. This is the aggregate mine from the deposits. And we're going to be pulling off the road here, and hopefully there is enough room. So this is where you get to see it all, and the sun's coming out for a glorious view of this this angle.
Picture for
The hills beyond that riparian corridor that have the nice big blue oaks, that's the Chico sandstone, that purple stuff, much deeper soils. You can see how the oaks respond to growing on those deep soils on the Chico sandstone versus the scraggly oaks on the shallow Tuscan sandstone. And that Chico sandstone has a stratiferous cap of Lovejoy alluvium. Okay, that's part of today's mind-bending exercise. Is there's Lovejoy cobbles on the stable summits over there. The Lovejoy is over here. There's the source. So this didn't used to look like this. Table Mountain was much more expansive, and those are the old alluvial remnants, and now you're looking at the back wearing of Table Mountain, leaving its byproducts all the way over there on those hills that couldn't get there in today's topography. And here's your hydraulic mine sediments, the star of the show, right, Garrett? So there's your setting. Those are Tuscan foothills off in the background, Cascade, that's Sierra, that's Ione, and then there's Chico where those big happy blue oaks are, and those the middle range hills there that we drove across with an alluvial cap of Lovejoy alluvium on top of it. What is it? It's Cretaceous sandstone representing the old Pacific shoreline. It's got lots of fossils in it, and big like nautilus fossils people find, lots of clamshells, 70+ million years old, the old beach.
Is this the same Ione as down at Ione?
I'd say so.
You get octosols on it.
We got an octosol with PSSAC. Incoherent, okay? So lots of little land slips. Dean, we used to call those cat eyes, right? I haven't been in that conversation in a long time. You see a lot of little slumps. And so it would not even be here if it wasn't protected by the basalt cap. Okay, if that basalt wasn't covering it, this stuff would have melted away a long time ago. As you drive to Oroville, you see springs and slumps. It's just like butter. It's on its way out.
Okay, cool.
Done.
So as we're all joining up now, I want to introduce Hannah Areed, who is economic geologist at Chico State. Her and I came in the same year, so we're both young faculty. They're hungry and want to come engage with the community. So I asked Hannah to come talk about the Cherokee mine in general, about placer deposits, maybe give a little one-on-one level about kimberlites, because that's part of the story here. How did this material get here and why? Right? We didn't end up going up to the mine. It's a mysterious site that's hard to get into by ownership, and it's a twisty, crappy road that, we're not going to be able to probably handle that too well today. So I wanted to get that context of why the material was there that got washed down. How could that be, that kind of stuff? And it ties into the capping of the materials with the Table Mountain deposits and stuff like that. Is that a reasonable setup? All right. Perfect. Take it away, Hannah. Thank you so much.
Okay, hi. I'm an economic geologist / igneous geologist, so this is all like very soft for me. It's quite strange, but it's really cool. I wanted to talk briefly a little bit about the context of the mine. This was the biggest hydraulic gold mine in the world for a while, so this was a big deal, even though it looks like a scrubby hillside nowadays. And if you actually drive back up the road a bit, and look away to your right, you can see a massive yellow cliff face. So that's the mine, right? For those of you who don't know a lot about hydraulic mining, which I'm learning about rapidly since moving to California, basically it requires a large amount of water, which, as you can probably imagine, except for today, is usually quite a big problem in California. So back in the late 1840s, early 1850s, when this site was discovered along with gold in the American River, this was part of the 49ers gold rush. The miners came, they set up camp in this tiny place in the middle of nowhere, and they actually brought in electricity. Cherokee was the first place in Butte County to have electricity. This was a really big deal. This was very much a winter enterprise. They needed the water to be able to mine out the sediments. So eventually in the 1870s, they actually built a dam in the next valley over called the Concow Dam and set up a reservoir there. And then they built a series of channels and flumes to pipe water from that reservoir so that they could use gravity and decreasing pipe size to increase the pressure of that water and fire it against the hillside to mine out this sediment. So this is part of the context for what you guys are doing today, right? They would fire the water against the hillside, they would channel the sediment through sluice boxes where they were able to separate out the gold from the gang minerals, the waste minerals, via their relative density differences. And the gangue material was then just funneled out into the river channels and piled up and caused large problems, which actually contributed to the shutting down of the mine. They weren't allowed to hydraulically mine this area after 1887, even though it was mined by drift mining, like underground mining, until 1894, which is when it fully stopped, right? So this is a historically very, very important area. It's really where I wanted to go, which I think is really cool. Okay, so let's talk about gold and where it came from. So this is a placer deposit, which is basically a sedimentary deposit. These are deposits that are formed in rivers, and they can actually form with any particularly heavy or dense material. So gold, things like magnetite, or some of our iron ores, some of our platinum, and other materials can all form placer deposits because it's basically sorting of the sediment load of the river by energy, right? So particularly dense or particularly large materials will settle out first, and then as you get smaller, lower and lower energy, you get lower and lower density, as you guys probably know, because you deal in sediments probably much more than I do. So this is where we basically are looking. We're looking in these relatively high energy but low enough energy that the material can settle out, and there you get the pockets of these very dense materials. So gold is one of those. As Garrett mentioned briefly, this is also interesting because there are about 400 or 500 diamonds mined out of Cherokee, and this is really weird, really, really weird, because we don't know of any sources of diamonds in California. Diamonds come up from the mantle, very, very deep in the earth, in a very rapid, bizarre volcanic eruption that produce what we call diatremes, which are kind of like carrot-shaped deposits going down into the earth. So they have to be very volatile, rich magmas, and they have to bring the material up from very deep in the mantle very quickly. Otherwise the diamonds don't last, right? They decompose on the way up. So we usually find these things in very stable, very ancient continental crusts. So places like South Africa, right, the African Craton, or Canada. There's a lot in the Canadian Shield, the slave provinces. So this is really strange because we're in California and this is not very old crust. So why do we have diamonds forming? This is the only place they come from, is these diatremes. And I actually don't have an answer to that. It's really weird. It's an ongoing mystery. We don't know. A guy from the CGS emailed me with some locations of potential diamond things, but I haven't had a chance to look into them. And I'm also not sure I want to go alone, because apparently the last guy that went took an armed guard with him, because they're in dubious land. So not going to do that yet. But so this is one of our ongoing mysteries, right?
Do you assume that there are these tubes
I think
somewhere
so.
here buried?
I think it's quite likely that they are in existence. We've recently found more kimbalites in younger crust, but they're relatively small features, so they're only on the scale of kind of a kilometer to maybe 100 kilometers across. They're not very big, so kilometer sounds quite big, but it's not that big. So I think it would be quite easy to miss under all the cover, which is stuff that you guys love. But usually it's stuff that I want rid of. But yeah.
But
So,
diamonds are found in Arkansas as well.
they are, yeah, which is
What's our
a weird anomaly.
downstream explanation there? So there's a number of these anomalies around.
There are. It's just strange. I don't think anyone's found, there isn't like a well-established mechanism yet for how kimbalites actually come up. There are a lot of ideas, but in general they're usually found in cratons. But you're right, there's Field of Diamonds or Heart of Diamonds or something in Arkansas. Yeah.
Well, I might just add a little bit to it. The Cherokee is the Ione. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I think it's below the IOC. Yeah, it's
Okay, well, so the Sierras hadn't uplifted yet, so these channels were coming from central Nevada or somewhere. I mean, these old channels were grading to this delta that was out here before they were overrun by these basalts. So, I mean, there wasn't a Sierra Nevada when this stuff, the basalts that we see on these islands was precipitated by the Basin and Range extension. So, I mean, who knows where these diamonds could have come from the center of Nevada or Utah or wherever
Arkansas.
Well, I mean, for a lot further east, and I mean, we see pure quartzites in some of the what we call the Laguna Age formation terraces that have to be reworked ion, which probably came from somewhere over in Nevada before the Sierras uplifted.
That actually leads very nicely to the next thing I was going to mention.
Oh,
which
sorry.
is our rivers. No, you're fine. You're totally right. So this is the closest idea of where the rivers actually ran, because as you quite rightly said, we didn't have the Sierra Nevada. They think they only uplifted in the last 3 to 5 million years, very rapidly. So before that, we think that the rivers actually ran from central Nevada, in a highland in central Nevada, all the way to the sea here. So the Yuba River and the American River have been reasonably well studied and correlated, I think. Not that much work has been done, as far as I can find, on this area particularly, but there is a potential river. This one, on this map, it's called the Buckeye Bear Hill Channel, but I think it leads basically to Cherokee. So because of this, they were looking at potential sources for where the gold had come from, right? So we know that there are the lode gold deposits you guys have probably heard of in Eastern California. These are basically quartz gold veins, and I brought some samples which are not quartz gold veins, but they give you some idea of what they look a little bit like. I don't have quartz gold veins, or else I would be not teaching at university. But this is some idea of what they might look like. This is actually a quartz pyrite vein, which is fool's gold. So if you like squint a bit, you can pretend it's gold.
Do you have a bunch of it that we could sell?
No. And you wouldn't get much for this anyway. I actually don't know who this is from.
Please
I found it
give
in my
her
old
for
school.
us.
That's what I'm saying. I'm trying to set up a scale.
Please. Yeah, wrap in the gold. There are 2 options actually. That way. The other potential source that they're thinking of is there's a porphyry deposit. There's a bunch of porphyry deposits in western Nevada, which are copper gold deposits that are formed at depth around a pluton. And there's also one over near Greenville, California, which is maybe a porphyry, maybe something else. But there we have polymetallic veins, and they do have some gold in them. But I actually brought this one just because it's really pretty. But these are some of our polymetallic sulfides, which might be a potential source for these rocks as well. Okay. So that's pretty much what I've got.
Cool.
Are all of these,
Yeah.
are all of these,
Sorry.
are all of these metal deposits associated with hot water?
With hot water, yes. They're all hydrothermal deposits, pretty much. Yeah. So usually it's magmatic fluids that are given off at a late stage of crystallization of the magma body at depth, and they rise up and they evolve. The fluids evolve in composition through interaction with the rock, and they also mix with groundwater, and then that changing condition deposits.
Okay, I have this question about the diamonds. If they originated in some tube, kimberlite tube over there, and they moved over here, why would they concentrate? How could they concentrate so you could actually find 300 or 400 in one place?
That's a fair question. So my understanding, they are actually more dense than most of the stuff. So diamonds have a density of about 3.5 grams per centimeter cubed, and quartz and other minerals are somewhere around 2.5. So they are relatively more dense than a lot of the felsic material, at least in these deposits. So that would be one reason. They're also a little bit bigger, I think, often than some of the quartz grains that they're associated with. So I think it would be density.
And there are chromite mines here. Are they associated in the same way with the other metalliferous deposits?
I believe so, yeah.
And again, is that they would have the rare earth, the rare minerals as well. Some of them rare earths and rare minerals associated with them.
The chromite mines?
Yeah, and certain rare metals, I should say.
They might well do.
Like special ones that are used in special. But in Butte Canyon, Feather River Canyon, there's chromite deposits.
I didn't know that. Are they associated? Are they placer deposits?
No,
Okay.
they're
Hard rock.
hard rock.
Okay.
The ultramafic belt.
Right.
Okay, that
right.
makes sense.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. You should explain ultramafic belt maybe.
Where's our
Yeah.
Okay, we are, there's pink is Table Mountain, so we're right here. So some of these, and this photocopy didn't work out so well, a lot of this is metasedge, but you can see these serpentinitic looking beds through here. This is classic serpentine in the Sierra Nevada, and Sawmill Peak is part of that complex associated with the faulting. and the ultramafic rock, and Highway 70 through the North Fork of the Feather is just a wonderland of looking at, you know, the ophiolite suites and all of that.
For the students that maybe don't know all that stuff, so that sedimentary or those serpentinetic rocks are related to contact metamorphism. Is that how that probably happened, or can we get some enlightenment not on
Big
the
picture?
Yeah, big picture, because that's where some of us don't know. So please listen in. This is going to be good.
Anybody?
Like, why are the serpentines there? What's the mechanism that forms those? But in this case, is it like I said, contact rock? Like, why would that happen? For the students that maybe we're talking about igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary, and I've talked about subduction and a little bit about contact metamorphism, but why is that stuff there, and general big picture? Please come, everybody join in. Come on in, come on in. Let's hear it.
Hear from Roy.
Right, just, please, if you don't know, come in close.
Yeah, then you really won't.
Yeah.
A couple of things come to mind, and one is, first of all, what is the state rock?
Serpentine.
Yay! Just everything has to probably have a state fossil. We have a state mineral. We have a state everything. But secondly, serpentine. It's not my stuff. I deal with the surface, but nevertheless, most of it, if not all of it, and I wish I had Eldridge Moores here, my ex-colleague at Davis, would point out most of it's related to deep-seated metamorphism at depth related to subduction. Here goes the arm waving.
Keith's under the door.
Can I be the craton?
Yeah, you can dive in. Yeah. Anyway, you can envision mountains, huh? And here goes the subduction zone, a la Cascade. Similarly, it goes down deeper and deeper and deeper, and under great pressure, it's very simplified, great temperature, and then we go through the whole stages of rock development. Anyway, the serpentine and the so-called greenstone is a product. And so today in the coast ranges, great outcrops of serpentine, associated with asbestos, by the way, particularly in the Sierra, and there's lots of challenges with asbestos on the roadways. In fact, really digressing, Caltrans, 90% of their geologists are all working on environmental, trying to clean up what they did the previous 100 years.
Exposing a lot of stuff.
Well, they are. And much of it relates to asbestos in the roads and so on. So anyway, that's a highly simplified version, and what would probably be very helpful with a series of diagrams, which I'm not going to do, at least I'm not going to do, is just show the evolution of the landscape, the big landscape over millions of years. And I'm going to digress for a second here and go off and to ask a general question. We're talking about hydraulic mining, Cherokee, all the other mines in the Sierra, foothills essentially. All that stuff ended up out in the valley, in the Central Valley, in most cases the Sacramento Valley. And that's, gave rise to all the increased sedimentation rates and floods. For those of you from Marysville, Yuba City, you've gone through that. And that wave, and there's lots of classic papers that dealing with that. You can probably, USGS professional papers are 100 years old now. Anyway, that great wave of sediments until the and tell me the year that whatever the law was passed, which I've forgotten now, 1880s, 1890s, that prevented hydraulic mining. Now I cut it down anyway. Sediments went out through the delta, and for those of you working in the delta sediments, you're looking at the impact of hydraulic mining of 100 years ago. The anthropic impact is great. It's fantastic. It modified the landscape more than you can envision from a geomorphic standpoint, and went out through the delta and into the bay and out through the Golden Gate Bridge. And so that is still out there today. And I just happen to be working on a typical litigation case down in the Feather River flood some years ago area, and geotechnical case. We had a bunch of borings went down, and eureka, I got to the base of the fill of the hydraulic mining debris, which not too many people know. Anyway, it's getting eroded now. It's getting cleaned up, going out. But much of the Sierra Nevada foothills here is sitting offshore now. It's either still entrained somewhere in Sacramento Valley sediments in the floodplain, or it's offshore under the Golden Gate out the bay. The big bay bar, most of that was produced within 5 years, 10 years today.
The auriferous gravels, you're saying, of the Sierra.
Not only the auriferous gravels, but all the silt. The gravels are still sitting around here, but they were taken. But the fine grained sediments get carried out in the floodplain. In fact, it's not Lindgren. Who did the famous hydraulic mining debris in the Sierra Nevada? Was it Lindgren? No. No, he did auriferous gravels. lost his name.
That's
but it
okay.
was a famous paper. Same guy did a lot of things. But anyway, famous paper. He calculated this 1906 or 7 or something like that. He calculated that the impact of hydraulic mining debris on landscape evolution, and certainly on sedimentation in rivers, far exceeded the impact of the last major glaciation in the Sierra Nevada. Isotope stage 2, late 15, 18 K. Anyway, I got off opalites. I don't care about
No,
opalites.
good. That was perfect. Thank you. Like I said, remember, I want to remind everyone that we're not all at the same spot of knowledge and nomenclature. So it's good to take a step back sometimes and talk about that stuff. So,
Roy, can you talk about the inversion? You were talking about that a little bit later.
Were you going to get into inversions of topography and all that business?
Go for it.
Go for it.
Okay. Boy, here's some arm waving, literally in every sense of the word. It was pointed out by your colleagues here that there are a bunch of table mountains, that flat surfaces sitting way above the modern drainages. And there's a whole series of table mountains, Oroville Table Mountain, going all the way down to Sacramento and even east of Fresno. And they're all high-level plains sitting there. They're volcanics. And the question is, okay, what is a lava flow doing on top of a mountain? In many cases, not all, but in many cases, underneath that particular volcanic cap, you can envision on the landscape here, 50, 100 feet thick, there are fluvial gravels, large gravels. It turns out that these so-called table mountains invariably are inversions of topography. The topography has been inverted. Think today, if you were sitting right here and a big lava flow occurred from some source, it wouldn't go on top of the hills, it would go down the valley. So all those lava flows went down which were then valleys, paleo valleys, but they're much more resistant, particularly in granitic rocks, granodiorite in the Sierra Nevada, and that rock is evolved. In other words, it eroded through joint plains and eventually, but the volcanic stayed up there. So the former low, the valley is now the high. The topography has been inverted. And that's what we see here. So the landscape evolved like this. Here's a valley, by V, like that. Here's the next valley, dunk, dunk, it goes down. Highly simplified, and forgetting all the slope wash and everything else that moves down, and landslides and so on. Highly simplified, but when you look at these old channels on the map that your instructor has instructed us, whatever is appropriate nowadays, has put out here, and you can thank you. And fascinating, because these are interpreted paleo drainages looking for the old channels that are auriferous, I presume. And then many of those were found on top of ridges, on what are now ridges today. Sure. Everything else has been eroded down. As the Sierra continues its uplift, still, this is slow, the landscape is cutting down, and so we see the modern channel is nothing compared to the old channels above it. And speaking of gold, I once got paid in gold nuggets. I took a consulting fee in gold. and it was in Latin America. You brought your samples out. I'm not going to bring my gold samples out.
Your nugget.
No, that's my nuggets, the only one I have. I got a bunch of them, actually. It was in Colombia, but similar terrain. Mining, hydraulic mining, and finding in this case I was looking for old Pleistocene channels, buried channels, and the dredges were there, the same old Yuba dredges, and that's another whole story. You familiar with old dredge tailings and so on? Anyway, Yuba came from the Yuba River. Yuba 21, Lisa it was called, taken apart, I'm really digressing, out of this area, out of the Yuba drainage, got taken apart, carried down to Colombia, where environmental laws were next to zip. In fact, they are zip, unless you can buy your way around anything. And anyway, it was reassembled. It was then an American mining company. They did so. I wish I got paid. They told me, do you want to get paid in, what can we pay you? And I said, I'll just take my university salary. I was taking a quota leave, which I was making payments. This was at Davis. I was making payments on a duplex in those days. So they gave me 1 month's salary, and the guy told me, how about this, the option? 1% of all gold we recover within the next 1 year as a result of your report. I was chicken. I didn't do it. And to make a long story short, did find a whole bunch of old channels by just reinterpreting all their logs with the different meant a mindset. I just had a mental model and I tested it and it worked out. This is science working ass backwards, but it worked. And so they brought this old dredge to lease it down, and by this time they got Colombianized, which means nationalized. Colombians took them out, kicked them out. It's a long story. And they, of course, they stole most of the gold that was supposed to be sold to the Bank de la República in Bogota. It never got there. But regardless, they took out millions, and I don't know how many millions. Smuggled it, most of it, in an old DC, whatever the commander was, not a DC. I used to fly in that thing. Anyway, and it got smelted, and there used to be a big smelter down by Martinez, and it's gone now, but all that debris is still somewhere in your lungs probably. But in any event, they made a lot of money out of it, and so I never did get, I went back a few years later and they gave me an
honorarium.
Well, the honorarium was this. They said, look at, caballero, unfortunately we're not going to pay you in
we don't have any dollars.
Well, in pesos, because you don't have a work permit. I said, fine, I don't want the pesos colombianos. So therefore, can we pay you in gold nuggets? And I thought they were joking, of course. And so in my crummy Spanish, I said, making a joke, I don't quiero solamente oro nuevo. I don't want your old gold, haha. Gringo loco. And so anyway, a week later, it came back, and they waiting for the DC-3. You never know if it's going to show up or not. And we're all drinking aguardiente, the local fire water there, and they brought out the stuff, and the lady, senora, brought out a little Bull Durham, the old tobacco bags. She made them. They dumped out all these nuggets, and they weighed them in a little scale that was rusted and everything, and they said, essentially in Spanish, you didn't want old gold, so we hydraulically mined it for you this morning.
I like my gold fresh.
So with that, let's get a group shot right here and get ready to go to the next spot, because there's more stories.
I'm sorry, I wandered off.
Yeah, and the idea though that when we get down there is we've got a place we're going to go and eat lunch, and then there's going to be some unstructured time. We want people just kind of be able to walk around a little bit and look at things. It's not all a tour with guided information. So I just want to give that context. When you're up there, look into that stuff. I'll just do the big picture right now. We're at Table Mountain, and behind us, we drove across a couple of the surfaces that Andrew's talked about, the Lovejoy, Colluvium, Alluvium. I think we see some Ione. I'm just going to wave my hands a lot. When we get up on the slope, you can see Sutter Buttes behind us. That's another big regional thing that we could talk about just for a second, because I don't want to push it too far. I want to keep this tour on time. But it's dynamic and how it formed the Butte Basin and why the clay soils are there. And that's just as context, because we're going to drive down this thing that is sticking its tongue out into the clay basin. That's the Butte Basin. We also are going to see the Coast Range across the way to kind of talk about some of these things and tie it together. And if you squint really hard, you can see the Black Butte Reservoir, Black Buttes that are comparable material to this is basalt across the way. And hopefully we can squeeze and pinch and squeeze and see that stuff when we look. That's all I have. Do you have any other big picture items that we want to talk about here?
Big old dissected Lovejoy fans coming off the Table Mountain, so you can see the drainage is cutting into them. So we have kind of a couple different surfaces here, but big, impressive, steep fans for this area. And
Lovejoy,
so you can see
what is Lovejoy?
It's basalt, so you're going to see a lot of the basalt fragments in here, and some of this older stuff does have a Durapan, and it's got clay alluviation and formation. So these are some of the older fan remnants that are now dissected by current channels. But you can get the real nice feel of the pitch and the big fan shapes coming off of the Table Mountain itself. And when we get up top, we're going to probably get a little bit better view, see some of the Ione, the slumpy slopes, and see where these fans are connected to some of the major drainage coming off of Table Mountain.
I want to say a little bit about the big geomorphology that Andrew keeps using, fans and hilltops and things like that, and really we're on the edge. For those of you, I'm really talking to students here, you're looking at big landforms here. You've got ridges, you've got a whole Sierra, which is a mountain range that has uplifted and tilted at the same time, in the valley, which is really not a valley. What is it? It's a trough. It's a trough. It really is truly a trough that is defined by the Coast Range and the Sierra, and it's filled up with sediment. The river just happens, the river did not form that trough. The river occupied that trough. When does a gully become a valley? When does a valley become a trough? Well, those are bigger issues than we can even see from here, but you might want to keep that in mind when we're talking about what's the valley. The Great Central Valley, in my opinion, is really not a valley. It's
in
really
the sense of like the Grand Canyon.
exactly. Good analogy. Exactly. Right. So think about this. Sometimes our ecosystems occupy places, and sometimes they create places. And I think it's sort of the dynamic is important to keep in mind. So I'll leave it at that.
Anyone else who's good at the cause? Zeke.
The Lovejoy, we find it in Chico Creek Canyon or by Chico. I've heard there's pieces of it down by Vacaville, and that source is up by Quincy, isn't it? So it's like this huge regional scale flow that you see little pieces of it all over the place.
And it's not in Butte Creek, and that's why the dredgers were able to get so far up in the canyon bottom.
Keep coming.
What's the age of the Lovejoy compared to the Tuscan? Is it much
It's like 19 million versus 2.5 million.
Okay.
You see basalt on the top of some of these ridges, but you also see it in the bottom of some of the current canyons.
Good question.
There it got buried by the Tuscan. Here it didn't get buried by the Tuscan. We're at the outer, the Tuscan kind of banked off of this, as opposed to burying it up in Chico Creek Canyon. And I'll just tell you a quick little soil mapping story. Okay, mapping on the Chico Creek fan and the Butte Creek fan. Usually the size of the watershed determines the amount of coarse soils that you see out on the fan and the proximal fan. And I was mystified because Chico Creek fan had more coarse soils than the Butte Creek fan. Butte Creek's a bigger watershed. And it mystified me, and I went out and did transects and did particle size analysis, and it proved me that I was finding more coarse soils on the Chico fan. And then it wasn't until finally working in the foothills that I realized Chico Creek had Lovejoy in the canyon. Butte Creek did not have Lovejoy in the canyon, so Butte Creek Canyon was allowed to deposit those coarse sediments in the bottom of Butte Creek Canyon, way up in the foothills. Chico Creek, it was funneled out into the valley by the Lovejoy.
Shot it out at higher.
Yeah, and it goes against the normal model of watershed size. Took me a couple years to figure that one out.
Well, let's go look. Contemporary riparian corridor of Dry Creek, which has been buried by the sediments. As we drove down the road, you saw the big open pit gravel aggregate quarry that's the Knife River mine. They're mining that actively. We're going to head downstream, and you can see where we're going off to the left, where the riparian corridor kind of bulges out, and there's grassland on the left, and it kind of bulges out into it. We're going to drive down into that and get to go see some cool bedding along the creek, a place where the contemporary stream's cutting through some of the Tuscan material, and hopefully we're going to be able to walk out across the creek and get out on the landform that has the vernal pools, and they might be a little wet today, right? Pretty cool. This is, like I said, if from nerding out on soils and soil formation, this is as cool as any of the other mud flow sequences that we have around here that have really been the cornerstone of a lot of what we know about soils and soil formation. Pretty cool stuff, Mount Shasta and otherwise. Just quickly, right to the left, we have the Sutter Buttes, world's smallest mountain range. Once again, a phenomenal thing that it's privately owned, so it hasn't been developed. Nobody gets to go out there, which is hopefully going to be a long-term win for everyone when we can go out there, right? Dylan showed a picture of it in his talk from one of our favorite field trips. It's a wild place. The story I've heard, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's a connection between the Sutter Buttes and Lassen Peak as we see it today, in that they're the same type of igneous material and a similar concept, much bigger dynamics, but they are connected as relatives in these kind of bigger system dynamics. I think I want to take the rebuttal down where it's quiet, just because I don't want to have to hear it's too quiet. But there's that, just consider that, right? Coast Range across the way, Snow Mountain Wilderness, one of the least populated, least visited places around, right? The Coast Range wildernesses of Snow Mountain and the Yola-Boli don't see a lot of people, but they're really cool. Yola-Boli is the head of 5 rivers or something like that. It's a really incredible place that's got Trinity, Eel, Mattole, or not Mattole, but stuff farther down, and it's the headwaters of all these things. Really a cool spot that we can see. I'm just doing the big hand-waving overview because we can't go there today. But future tour, west side of the valley. That's gonna happen someday. Not next year, but soon. Okay? Anyone else? Please.
Tell them the butte used to be about 7,000 feet before fluid stacked.
Okay. Terry said that to bring to your attention that the buttes were upwards of 7,000 feet tall before there was some eruptive events and erosive events. That's new to me. I love it.
Now it's what?
A couple thousand, 2,200, right? It's privately owned and whatnot. Zeke, some?
Ultramafics and Sawmill Peak.
Okay. Oh, right. So now I think Andrew's talked about Sierran and Tuscan enough, and so have we all. We can see the Sawmill Peak, which is the clear evidence of that Sierra Nevada material, versus the big planar slope that we can see now, which is that Tuscan material that was big successive flows of stuff as these giant volcanoes eroded from eruptions and lithification of snowfields and glaciers and carrying down these torrents of material.
That's one thing about Sawmill Peak. The fact that it butts right up to this lava flow that we can see out here makes it a really good landmark from all over the North Valley. You can see Sawmill Peak from Red Bluff, you can see it from I-5, you can see it from down by the Sutter Buttes, just because it's the first spot that really pops up down here at that 3,000 foot level. From everything to the north, it's flat.
And it looks like there's a little snow on top today. What's between us, the Tuscan surface, and Sawmill Peak? The West Branch, West Fork, whatever, that part of the feather gets pretty complicated with its ties into Lassen, but that's the Feather River that cuts between those two features, right? That's incised in that plot spot right there. Anyone else for the good of the cause? Well, let's head down and have lunch. Yeah. Cool. Well, let's go down there.
Just north of the Beale Airport.
Yep.
I was on one of the biggest, if not the biggest, gold dredge.
Okay.
That
was cutting up that part of the Yuba right there.
Yeah, I was on it while it was working.
They had to be incredible machines. And no hearing protection, I'm sure.
Is that Lovejoy?
Yes, yeah.
So
and I can't give you any story for that.
So is it gone all the way around?
So maybe these hot spots kind of relate to it.
Oh, look at that. It's right apart.
That's what they call that.
It's just little chunks of basalt from up on the top there, but it's got this great weathering rind where it's just coming apart from water. Yeah. That's really, but there's a little nugget in the middle. Well, the basalt they're talking about is that table up there, and that material's just all sort of coming down through colluvium.
Hunk of basalt, and then it's all wrapped up in some other stuff like a weather. You think that's just weathering? It's not like a more softer.
Oh no,
it's like clay.
Isn't this the Tuscan formation? Isn't this the Tuscan sort of mud flow? Isn't this?
That's what I don't know. Dylan knows.
Well, I'm talking like I know. Andrew's the authority around here.
What do you think, Dylan? So this isn't the mud flow then? I thought this was sort of, because the mud flow has a bunch of rocks connected to it.
It could be, but I mean the closest source around it's
Yeah.
What?
It's kind of.
weathered.
Is it just is it a piece of that's been
I think it's a
sandwiched, or
weathering
is it-
rind.
That's what Dylan.
Yeah.
Weathering rind.
Yeah.
This is the entire rind? Like this
Yeah.
is one
Yeah.
coherent rock, and now it's been weathered inward.
That's
and
how
that
you
makes
make
sense.
soil.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't think I'd ever seen a clear picture of
Okay.
it before.
Yeah.
Lovejoy's
Want it
Creek,
back?
right?
Oh yeah.
Okay, here's Chico Creek
Oh.
Canyon. You kind of know what you mean, yeah.
The pieces are always like chunky as hell and have these hard, sharp edges.
Mm-hmm. And brutal to dig in.
Yeah.
Some of the worst digging I've ever done.
Well, not as
Like-
bad as that other one you sent me. What'd you call it? One's enough, or
Waffle.
yeah, that one.
They're pretty close.
I use
The
that.
Lovejoy's worse because they're angular, so they lock together.
Yeah.
The round ones, you can kind of, you know, strong arm them. And then there's a whole different geomorphic sequence on the west side. And then the east side, of course, is just metavolcanic. You know, there's nothing going on up there. You just hit, you know, greenstone on the other side. That was softer, that, you know, did erode, like in, you know, Schleman's inverse topography. It didn't erode too far, but far enough. So the east side isn't as scarped as the west side. It's almost like this could have been like a lava delta, because there was no constraint on the west side. Yeah,
Spread out. That's a term, lava delta.
Yeah, I never heard it. I made it up yesterday.
You say you made it up yesterday.
We need to
It's
start,
a fresh one.
We need like a board of Andrew words, so stream piracy and lava delta.
I feel so hip. I know all the new lingo before it's even out there.
And right here, the Red Hot Chili Peppers played once.
Oh, really?
Right here, Field of Dreams. Believe it or not.
Right.
Everything happens here. This is the freeway of flowing dirt. So there's a nice profile of Sawmill Peak, the end of the Sierra, and then the Cascade. See that?
Yeah.
Boom, boom.
All that granite starts appearing as we drive up Highway 70.
Those are the plutons, so, you know, the old magma chambers that have now been exposed due to erosion. And
Right,
without getting too
dome-like
fancy,
shape.
those were like the furnaces of former volcanoes that aren't there anymore. And, you know, start thinking about the volcanic cap of the Sierra, and like you drive 80 to Tahoe and you see those flat plateau
Yeah,
preserve
yeah.
spots. That's the volcanics, just all that remains from when it was when it used to be getting fed by subduction, and it's no longer. And Dylan can fact check me on that, due to the development of the San Andreas Fault, taking, you know, cutting off the subduction. So that's why, you know, you still have the active Cascades. It's north of the Triple Junction where there's still subduction.
Yeah, I guess we have something to be thankful for with the San Andreas Fault. We got earthquakes, but we traded them for volcanoes, I guess, right? Or vice versa.
we don't have lava coming through our
Yeah.
towns.
Yeah, it's getting shaken up a little bit.
So here's like some Tuscan islands within this corridor. That's
So,
kinda
like
far.
down there, is there like shallow to CR or?
This would be pretty much all these deep mine sediments.
Oh,
Yeah,
this-
yeah.
oh,
This,
okay.
and when you're seeing all these cottonwoods, you're looking at the mine sediments.
Okay.
Why do you see cottonwoods on the mine sediments?
They're dead. In the mine sediments down by the water, where the water's cutting through, and you'll see the cottonwoods associated with the creeks anywhere. But you're in this fluvial system here, and you know the channels jump around, and there's a lot of water, and you know it's a dynamic place, and cottonwoods are adapted to that. And we'll see some oaks too, and I'm kind of interested to see the how big some of the trees have gotten with this known time. You know what I mean? You have a pretty good control here of, you know, some of these bigger trees are like, holy cow, that grew in, you know, 120 years, you know.
We see that in the mine tailing piles, Calaveras County. You have blue oaks growing out of the top of a pile of cobbles.
Wow.
That have been there for 80, 90 years.
So all of these trees are, you know, post-deposition. It's impressive. That's a pretty big valley oak up there in the middle. So they're, you know, remining this stuff for aggregate, and you know, they get some gravel, but I think more of it's for sand.
It's so very clean. Do they?
They're sieving it and washing it here. Yeah. And just seeing all that activity that we saw from the first overlook, I think that first operation hasn't been that big, but I think it's since the Oroville disaster that thing is blown up. Yeah. Everybody with a gravel pit's been making a lot of money.
So the black rocks in there, are those mostly the...
That looks chipped. That even looks like, you know, and they'll crush the basalt too, but yeah, it looks like a mix, but definitely the black is basalt.
I think I'm gonna mail you a piece of our Table Mountain. They also crush it for road bed.
Yeah.
They crush it into big cobbles for not riprap, but basically to line stream channels to try and protect them a little bit.
It's interesting they go to a small size.
Well, you know, I guess they start that size, but you see, maybe they're easier to transport. Not sure. So the ponding, is that on?
Yeah, just the way crusts form, and there are silty beds. There can be some silt loams in here too that, you know, you drive over it and let it crust enough, and it probably, you know, a lot of it.
That stuff, huh?
Yeah. And we're going to see more and more. I think this last stop, which I haven't been to, we should see some, you know, even a whole different reach finder. And as you get the silty stuff, you know, it's probably not worth so much. Although this is just very speculative. That the way they're, you know, expanding orchards on everything, and you know what they're willing to do to come in with trenchers and clay and try to bust up pan and mix up the loamy subsoils, and you know, just anything it takes to grow trees. And there's a place that out by Durham that's at the very edge of the Butte Basin, so it's heavy basin clays. It's kind of that transition from the fan to the basin is kind of tough to farm because it's not great for trees and it's not great for rice. You know, the transitions are tough, and so they've had just about everything there. And I think a lot of times you might see like alfalfa or something just as an intermediary, but they've been bringing in this loam and burying the clay to plant walnuts, and I think even some pecans.
$1,000 a walnut?
And I think they're getting some of it from here. There's, when you look at, even Garrett's got a shot in here, and
I didn't think that was physically possible to try and transform. Are they making mounds?
No, they're just laying it out on the fields on clay.
Wowie.
And where else would they be getting it? That's kind of, and then Garrett sent this image, and it's like, I bet that's where they're getting it. See this big old thing right there? I think they're digging that up and trucking it about 10 miles to buried adobe.
And what's going on down off Highway 20, the Yuba? There's a bunch of gravel trucks always running in and out of there.
There's a big hard rock mine in there for the greenstone, and again, Oroville boomed that place up too.
Okay.
Where were we today? We're looking at greenstone along the creek at Butte College. That's like, you know, that's the industry standard of, you know, good hard aggregate.
I also want to introduce John Weimer, who's the plant manager engineer for the Franklin Mine aggregate plant that we just drove through. He was hunted him down on our first tour out here. It was me, David, Kelly, and Andrew, and we were looking for numbers, and I called up John, and he's been very gracious the whole way through, allowing us to come out and helping us out to see the spot. He brought me here, and I was like, yes, I think people will like this, right? And you all can agree. I don't know if you have anything you want to say about the site or anything like that. I think David and Joel might want to preview some of the vernal pool stuff that we might be able to see. I don't think we're going to get to be able to cross the creek today. It's pretty high. We were going to try to walk across the creek down lower. I just don't think it's going to happen. But there's lots of other stuff to see for us to go do. Anybody else? So I said, I think we should go sit and eat lunch and talk about what we've seen so far. And then we're going to have some time here just for some, don't fall in, don't get washed away, but we're going to have time here just to wander about a bit.
Vernal pool, for those of you who don't know, and I think most of you have some familiarity with them, I look at them as refugia in the landscape for native species. They are wet places where our annual invaders have trouble growing. And as a result, the plants growing in those vernal pools, and in fact you get a vernal pool flora associated with this little circular seep along the top of this hill. You actually get a vernal pool flora in there already because of this longevity of water into the dry season. Vernal pools have become an important jurisdictional issue for the Corps of Engineers, Environmental Protection Agency, Fish and Wildlife Service. They support a lot of wildlife and plants that are rare. And they're rare partially because they're vernal pool species, and the vernal pools themselves have been a lot disrupted with rice farming, plowing, now almonds, etc., etc. Okay, houses to be sure. Okay, but that's your introduction right now to a vernal pool landscape. I want to get back to this human inhabitation of this landscape for just a moment. Coincidentally, the end of all this dynamic water flow, mud flow, boulder roll that Andrew has been talking about all morning, coincidentally, as that sort of stopped, as that dynamics stopped, somebody came onto this landscape. In fact, the first people, the Aboriginals, came onto this landscape. Associated with the end of the Pleistocene was the inhabitation of North America by humans. Not by accident that happened. It was coincidental that the glaciers began to retreat, sea level began to rise. People found this was a good place once they bridged whatever was the barrier between where they came from and where we are now. Once they bridged that, they found, hey, this is a pretty good place to live. And they began to radiate into the rest of the North America. At least this is, right now, in my opinion, what probably happened is these people were coming across as long as 22 to 28,000, maybe 30,000 years ago. They were not coming across anything, they were going along the edges of the glaciers. They were seafarers who probably came along the coast, taking advantage of river mouths. They were people who were used to using small craft in tidal zones, etc., along the shore, and probably, in my opinion, probably came onto the continent that way before they ever came across a land bridge. The significant part of this, and I'm cutting through so much stuff that we could discuss, to me, is that climate change is something that's been going on as part of all of our prehistorical heritage. It's been going on at higher rates and lower rates than it's going on now. And in fact, when those people came around, first people on the continent, where was the sea level at that time?
400 feet.
Where? 400 feet lower than it is now. Go to the Golden Gate and look out there a mile and you'd still be looking at dry land.
Farallon
and 400 feet down, sorry?
Farallon Island.
Exactly, okay, that's my point. Where now, we're not going to find 12,000-year-old remains on top of this hill, I pretty guarantee you that, okay? But those 12,000-year-old, 15,000-year-old, even 20,000-year-old remains, where are they?
Out there at the shoreline.
Probably at the mouths of rivers, probably in the rich sea coast. The Aboriginals themselves say we were maritime cultures. That is to say, they took advantage of the margins of the ocean. And those were the resource-rich areas. There were a few grizz around to argue that point, I suppose. But the point simply is that we're just now beginning to understand some of these first geomorphic soils dynamics that coincide with human migration dynamics. These are just things for you to think about. They don't have a thing to do with vernal pools at this point. Tomorrow we'll have the same discussion. I can show you on our preserve. For those of you who want to carpool out, probably about 1:30 or 2 tomorrow afternoon, north of town, about 10 miles, 12 miles I'd say, from the Oxford Suites, or wherever we happen to be at the time we may be at the soil judging. We'll take a little tour out there and look at vernal pool systems and talk about them. Now, the last thing I'll cover, and I can go on, if you think Andrew can go on and on, I can go on. Last thing I want to cover though is sort of the scale of things. Okay, we've been looking at, and I actually said something to you about valleys and the difference between a valley and a trough. When does a stream make a valley? When does a gully become a valley, etc. When you start talking about scale, you start talking about how do we interpret what scale is. We've had a very extensive introduction to this landscape. Extensive in the true word meaning big. We've looked at big features in the landscape. Every now and then we've seen an outcrop. We've seen a layer of soil. We've seen a layer of mining debris, something like that. We're about to get more intensive because I'm going to introduce Joel, who's the most intensive guy, but that's his small scale stuff. And one of the papers in here is a study that Joel Butterworth did. By the way, I'm president of PSSAC. Joel is the next president of PSSAC, incoming president, so it's appropriate for us to stand on the top of the hill and holler. But, okay. My little essay covers some of the stuff I just talked about. Joel has a much more, let's call it scientific analysis of some vernal pool hydrology, which I just found in working with him on a particular litigation case was just fascinating in the detail. And what I'd like Joel to talk about in general is first a little bit of vernal pool hydrology, why vernal pools are where they are. What causes a vernal pool? What's the cause of a vernal pool?
Restrictive layer.
Restrictive what?
Layer.
Restrictive layer. Matt thinks vernal pools are caused by restrictive layers.
Well, that's part.
Rain.
There's a little more.
Good.
Well, you need a depression.
You need a depression. Rick thinks they're caused by depressions. Right? Somebody said rain. Who said rain? Carrie says they're from rain. We know my money's with Carrie. Causes of wetlands are not soils. They are waters. Okay? But the soils have to be in a particular condition for those waters to become wetlands. All right, so you're all right, of course. And as Matt said, oh, that's not all of it. That's not all. Yes. Vernal pools are caused by water ponding on the landscape where they can pond and not dissipate either through direct down into the soil movement or, as we're seeing, lateral movement out of that depression. Thank you, Rick. Out of that depression. Okay? So that's really what a vernal pool is. And it turns out that because those areas maintain an ecological wetness long into the drier period of our springs, the plants that find their best purchase there are ones who can tolerate wet feet at active times of soil during the year. Okay? So, there is not a cause of vernal pools. There is not a cause. There's a hierarchy of causes. You have to have water. Overall, you also have to have a special climate. And that's even larger than the water issue. Because you can have vernal pools in other climates, but they're not our Mediterranean type vernal pools. So that's enough on that. But my point simply is, everything we've talked about has a polygenetic origin. There are so many things that contribute to what we're talking about, whether it's people on this landscape, vernal pools on this landscape, trees growing in the old mine tailings, whatever it is. There are a lot of reasons for that to happen. We just have to keep our minds pretty wide to accommodate all this. I find it's easy in a landscape. The easiest thing for me to understand a landscape, to read a landscape, go to the highest point in the landscape, voila, look around coldly and say, what's going on here? Where is that water going? Where is it coming from? How come those trees are over there and there's grasses up here? So once you begin framing that landscape that way, I go from extensive to intensive. And let me introduce Mr. Intensity, Joel Butterworth. Wherever Joel is. Right here. Did he disappear? Over here, over here.
Yeah. Well, so as David said, vernal pools, you need a restrictive layer. It could be a clay pan, a durapan, or a rock layer like salt flow.
Louder.
Just for context, Andrew tells me higher up at our first stop, the vernal pools and depressions, that series was the Anita series. It's a Durac work, so it's clay to the surface and has a durapan. So I don't know whether it's ponding on the clay or perching on the durapan, but one or maybe both. But that's what the driving force is in the vernal pools for the pools up higher up on this terrace. And then Andrew, the series and the depressions down here is
in this debris fall?
Well, no, out in the more natural areas, the vernal pools.
There's Faliger in the little swells and Anita in the big swells.
And the taxonomy of the Faliger is?
Like a dirty zero.
So, right, so that's a classic vernal pool.
northern hard pan vernal pool soil. Loamy A Horizon has a clay pan.
Falliger is pretty fine, yeah.
Okay.
It's got a loamier surface and then a clay argillic.
Indurated durapan or strong cemented
Yep,
durapan.
yep.
So the clay pan and the durapan are perching, causing the shallow perch water table that once all the pore space fills up and in the depression, then you get the pool. So it's a type of seasonal wetland. So just kind of like the general concept, the site that David and I worked on is underlain, most of it's underlain by the Red Bluff Formation itself, the Red Bluff itself, and the two primary series that support vernal pools at that site were Corning and Redding. So Corning is a Paley-Zero-Alf, I believe, and the Redding is a Dura-Zero-Alf. So the Corning's, the perch water table is over the clay pan. With the Redding soil, it's perching over the clay pan, where there is one, or over the Durapan. So my firm and David's firm were hired to do an evaluation of this site after it had been tilled using a chisel plow, and they tilled to 3 to 9 inches. And so there was another entity involved with this project that asserted that the tillage impacted the restrictive layers and therefore caused the vernal pools to no longer exist. And so we were, Terry's shaking his head, we were evaluated to evaluate what was the impact of the tillage on the restrictive layers. So basically I just looked at the soil survey data for saturated conductivity, hydraulic conductivity of all the horizons, and I did backhoe pits looking at morphology, texture, and took samples to estimate the saturated conductivity class, and determined that the other side, which was saying that the surface layers were causing the ponding and were the driving force behind the pools. After water balance monitoring or modeling, there's no basis to that. It was really what we all know, that the clay pan and durapans are the driving force behind the vernal pools.
Could you show them empirically that is the case too?
Empirically? Yeah. Well, I mean, what we have is the fact that the aerial photos, the signature of the aerial photos, pre-tillage and post-tillage, is the exact same signature. And in fact, a wetland delineation was done before the tillage and after the tillage, same extent of wetlands. So it didn't add up.
They were being litigated against, or what was the issue? Why were you called out?
I don't know if I should go into details.
Okay.
Yeah.
Joel?
Yeah.
I have a couple of comments. One, in a court case I had to go back in the history in the 1800s, and it's not called that then, but I forget what they're called, but it was like a county area, which is in now, like, just assume it's Sacramento County. There was an ordinance in the 1800s that required the landowners to fill our so-called vernal pools. And so we've done a 360 because of malaria.
Yeah.
They were, and the farmers or the landowners kept coming back. We can't fill them, they keep coming back.
Yeah.
And the other thing about naming the soils, when you look at a map and it's mapped as Redding, well, backstep a little bit. How long ago, Dave, was this symposium on vernal pools, about 1990 something or something?
Well, there's one in 74.
There were, no, it was after that.
And there was one in the 80s.
It was three days. It was in the 90s, early 90s.
Right.
Anyway, they kept saying, oh, the Redding soil and the San Joaquin, et cetera, et cetera. And I asked, I just bit my tongue until I finally bit it off, and I couldn't withstand it any longer. I said, have you dug a hole in the vernal pool? Oh, we can't do that.
Yeah.
Well, actually, strictly speaking, Redding is not in the vernal pool.
Yeah.
If you take the definition of a series, the drainage ways and the vernal pools are not Redding, Corning, or whatever. It's some other soil we don't. It's probably 1,000 different kind of soils.
Yeah.
So when most people ignore that point.
Yeah.
And they, oh, this is a redding soil. No, it's not a redding soil.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because I talked about that in the essay. And that survey was done in 1956. That was done at a time where vernal pools were just an unnamed inclusion.
Yeah.
Too small to map. And that's one reason why I mentioned the Anita. Because apparently, in this survey, it's a more modern survey, they called out separately the series that occurs in the depression.
Right.
Yeah. So one more note about the regulatory aspect of vernal pools. As David mentioned, they're regulated by the Corps of Engineers and the EPA. Well, they're currently regulated by the Corps of Engineers and the EPA. There is the final clean water rule was stayed by the Corps. It came out a few years ago. It's no longer in effect, and right now it's really quite uncertain as to in a couple of years when Congress, when the EPA issues the real final rule, whether vernal pools will remain subject to federal jurisdiction. If they fall out of federal jurisdiction, there's still the State Water Resources Control Board to protect them.
And they're moving just as fast as the feds are working to roll back their work.
They've been working on their policy for years now.
Vernal pools, people think that you can't touch them, you're not supposed to do anything. But if you don't burn them or graze them, Carrie, where's Carrie Ruiz? What's the preserve down there, the 10-acre one?
It's not, I think it's 5. Hogwaller Preserve.
Hogwaller Preserve. That's fenced off, surrounded by oranges or citrus, or it was. And they're mound, intermound like this, but you can't see them because it's preserved. They don't burn it, they don't graze it, and you don't see the flowers and everything like you do where if you burn it or graze it. So, you know, it's something that most people think you can't do anything with them, but you have to do something to make them beautiful so people can see all the flora and fauna.
They adapted to grazing.
Yeah.
Right.
What Joel and I have both been doing is not really science. We're talk story. That was talk story, you know? And who was it that showed yesterday? Jessica?
I didn't see
here?
any hand waving though.
Yeah, Jessica. How many of those points in your brain were lighting up when we're talking about Aboriginals versus, yeah, okay. Huh? But in general, Andrew is lighting up all those points. Joel has just done it. I've tried, that's my approach to teaching in general. Because you bring a group of students out who've never seen a soil, and you start talking to them about nitrate balance, you lose.
Might as well leave them
You
at
start
school.
talking about the first people to come onto this landscape, or a court case worth millions of dollars, you get a bit of a story out of it. And so I think it's sort of interesting that we've got such a range of experience here, and I really appreciate, and I'll just say as PSSAC president, thank you all for coming. It's great that you're here. Garrett has put on this whole thing. I've been able to sort of support him. Mary Reed, who's not here, is our executive secretary, but PSSAC thanks you. I've got membership applications for each one of you. If you're interested, we'd love to get you members of the organization. Okay.
And with that, let's head back to the cars and go to the next spot. We'll probably be there for half an hour this time instead of an hour and a half, and then we're going to roll out to the heart of this thing where they're actually managing it. And we got a nice big backhoe pit right in the middle of this stuff, right where they grow rice and orchards. So back to the vehicles, and we're going to go next stop. You can see through the canopy, you can see kind of the cottonwood signature, the lighter colored trees through kind of directly north. Right on the other side of that really is that vernal pool surface that we were talking about that's got the Anita, Gallagher, and what's the third one? Tuscan, thank you.
Tuscan soil, not formation.
Right, that stuff. What's cool about this spot that we didn't talk about last time is now we can actually see the native surface. So I'm standing on the edge of the native surface that's got the basalt and pieces in it, not this quartzy stuff that came out of the mine. The majority of that stuff is still over there. There's still big, thick deposits of that material over there. This is an interesting spot on the landscape because it's naturally constrained. And right over there you can see cars, that's Highway 149. Just on the other side of 149 is where the orchards start, and the land use that's not mineral deposit mining starts. And right across the creek there is an almond orchard, big one, and then keeps going, and then it goes down and it hits a hard left and turns south. And we're gonna head down that way after that. Talked about a couple different things going on. They have some of the mining operation stuff. Like, what do? They come out, they find a place they want to work, they scoop up sand, they put it in trucks, and they take it back to the factory, and they sieve it and do a bunch of stuff to it, depending on what the specs. It's all driven, John, basically by what you have tasked for at that time. You have some relative streams of stuff, but a lot of it's driven by a contract where they want a certain size, certain property. You're saying that structural stuff, it's all pretty comparable. This stuff for use.
Construction grade aggregates is our main outlet.
What do you think the stuff, is it coarse enough upstream in the other mines that they have different types of uses, or is it all enough, compared to like Knife River and the stuff upstream?
We utilize the construction grade aggregates more here than the other two facilities upstream of us. Those facilities, BCJ focuses a lot on the glass sand market, and they primarily extract the silica sands for that.
Okay.
So they don't get down into the alluvial sand and gravel.
Less processing for them. It's a cleaner thing, or do they have to process more to get that stuff out?
It's economically driven. Yeah.
On that tone, there are other mining operations just south on the south side of Table Mountain. There's another Sierra Silica. They're doing similar kinds of things. They're mining all these gravels that were capped by Table Mountain. I don't really have that much more to say right here. It's very interesting, like I said, that when you look at the aerial photo, this was a natural spot, and I'm sure we're going to learn more about this as we dive into this site more, not today obviously, but over time. There's a lot of resources through the Northeast Archive at Chico State, lots of pictures of the mine itself, a lot of that type of stuff. There's probably going to be some stuff here. What I thought was fascinating about all this is we didn't drive off to the south, but as we were driving in, you can see that they were actively diverting the flows during the time of the mining to try to purify things, keeping the sandier materials over here on the north, and there was a lot of clayier stuff to the south. And when you look at the aerial images, you'll see the remnants of these big strips where they were getting out more sands and silts and other things. Or what was happening down there? Do you remember?
On the south side, there's anywhere from 15 to 35 feet of fat clay.
Okay.
And that's basically where they diverted the clay, the fat material, if you will, or the clay material over to that side.
What kind of uses would that clay have, and what, like, if you were selling that stuff, what would they be using that for?
The only use we've had for it has been for clay liners or impermeable liners for the dump.
For the dump.
Yeah.
Or if you were going to build a constructive wetland, right? I mean,
correct.
Same kind of concept. You can use that type of material, or a racetrack. Yeah. What, at Silver Dollar Speedway? When you sit in the corner of turn 1 and you get blasted with the clay that comes flying off the track. That's a little insider Chico talk right there.
Most of that came from here.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. How long ago were
we
they?
Typically donate.
How long ago were you guys done mining that stuff?
We did a clay liner last year.
At Neil.
At Neil Road.
Cool.
Yes.
Cool.
And that was the last one.
Does anybody in the consultancy crowd work with those issues? That'd be a great side. Would you want to just give a 2-minute brief on that idea, right? I mean, I could say that historically they found a canyon or a spot outside of town, they drove it out there, they dumped it, they used to burn it, right? In Chico, we had there was a succession of old dumps. One was what is in town now, one is where town is encroaching, and then obviously Neil Road, which we drove by, and we could see when we got out of the alluvial surface and saw that big open expanse that was the first indication of the Tuscan we were driving over this morning. I kid you not, when I was a kid, I kid you, yes, when I was a kid, I had a dream once that Neil Road got so tall that it snowed on top. And it's coming true, right? When I was a kid, we would drive down into Neil Road landfill. It was this big hole in the ground, and now it is a engineered mountain. And this is an issue across the landscape, right? Landfills don't go away, and we're running out of them. We produce a lot of things that go to landfills that do not go away. They make new landforms, and they bring associated environmental concerns and issues of methane production, leachate of water, right? So they put in these clay liners. Now, they used to not, right? They used to just find a spot, bury stuff, and there was a lot of things that are leaching out of this. There's been a lot of consultancy dollars gone towards trying to remediate some of these things. I hope I didn't steal most of the story there, Joel. Was that okay?
I was going to comment on the idea of using clay liner to create wetlands.
Okay, cool.
Not well regarded by the Corps of Engineers.
For sure.
I've done, in 30 years, I've done one project
Cool.
in which the Corps allowed that.
So everything you're working on is just places that have a natural induration that allows that thing to happen.
Yeah.
Cool. I was kind of more joking, but yeah.
What about manure
Trying to cross up there. So on the landfill stuff, I mean that's pretty much all worked out, right? There's not a lot of frontier on that. Anybody can speak to that. It's pretty much they know what they're doing. They're lining. They're keeping them aerated so the methane production is, or they're trying to capture it. If you go to a landfill, they have pipes and tubes, and that's actually capturing natural gas. Oftentimes they'll have a gen set right there, and they can run that methane natural gas as some kind of generator right on site. Because before, you put all these organic carbon things down and you bury them, that doesn't mean there's not microbes, there's not water, there's not biogeochemistry happening that can produce reduced gases like methane, and then you get methane seeping out of these as point sources essentially that can be mitigated. So that's why now there's a lot more attention paid and a lot more money that goes into these types of structures, because we can't just, it's not just going away, to use that kind of term.
PSSAC, we had a meeting in Monterey that is one of the oldest ones in California, and they're actually remining they ran out of space or running out of space.
Right.
So now they're taking the metals and the organics and composting, and they're redoing the old landfill.
Right. So this is a good one, Jennifer. We didn't bring this up. So lately in the popular press and in academia, there's been this concept of now we have moved into a new geologic period, right? The period that's dominated by humans, the Anthropocene, right? And the signals of the Anthropocene are what we're standing on, right? Dramatic changes in fluxes of sediment, obviously the atmosphere as a reservoir and the rising CO2 that's associated with fossil fuel burning initially started with land use change, right? Tillage, putting carbon stored in soils into the atmosphere as CO2. This is one of the clear signals of the Anthropocene, is this mining, right? The fact that they were washing hillsides down to purify materials that were economically important, right? And they still are, but this is the Anthropocene. You're standing in it today. And there's a lot of signals of it around the world, and they've seen it in sediments have been one of the main ones, right? The rate. And Dr. Slayman earlier talked about the placer deposits going out. Now in California, we have the opposite problem. All the sediment is trapped upstream, right? So places like the Delta that are going to need sediments to continue to accrete and gain elevation as sea level rises are starved. There's not enough sediment coming into the Delta to really do what it needs to do. It's all trapped behind these giant check dams, right? Behind Oroville, Shasta, Bullard's Bar, everyone you could think of that would naturally have that melty, chocolatey water coming down every year as a natural process, right? Why do we have alluvial soils, alluvial fans, deltas? All the finest soils are built on natural erosion processes. That was enough hand waving. Anybody else? One last thing.
Climatically driven, though, mostly. I mean, this stuff moves through the system in slugs.
Sure.
And
of course.
I don't know. Most of the western streams, I think, are incising right now. I don't know many that are grading. There are a few. Yeah, there are a few of them, but especially coming out, on the Colorado Plateau and the Great Basin, that are. Some of them aren't dammed, but certainly the tributaries aren't dammed. You can see that there was a period of aggradation after the last Holocene, and it went on for several thousand years, and then it stopped about 700 or 800 years ago. And that wasn't because of cattle grazing or the Spaniards bringing stock up or anything like that. It was a change in the system. From aggradational to incision. I don't know. Good question.
Well, there's an association of that with sea level rise as well. As it depends on where you are in that system, but yeah. But you couldn't get aggradation now if sea level were to rise. You'd get aggradation in these valleys.
Well,
change the gradient.
If you follow that argument, then everything should be gradient. but it isn't.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you.
Yeah,
I'm just saying,
okay.
but there are mechanisms for aggradation as well in our system.
Well, it's just the free energy of the system. I mean, you can base level is a function of that, and that can be controlled by sediment, or it can be controlled by something breaching. You get a headward migrating nick point or something.
I guess I'd like to just add that Garrett brought up the fact that we're standing in the Anthropocene, but we are also able to adapt because we're rational, intelligent creatures, and we're watching it happen. Well, let me just offer an example. I have worked for decades in water purveying, and we're starting to manage our reservoirs, our dams, so that sediment is passing through, and sediment is actually actively taken down below the dams to be naturally entrained by the river at high flows, so that it goes back into the environment and is entrained and positioned by the river's activity. So, you know, it's not, don't feel bleak. Feel energized to look for creative ways to respond to things we didn't realize 50, 60 years ago that now we do. And we have to find creative ways, like mining our old landfills.
For sure. It's unfortunate that they didn't put an outlet at the bottom of the dam to let the sediment through when they built the dam.
That would have just plugged up.
Right.
Actually, there are really exciting ways to manage it. And
are they like building conveyors and dredging it out and doing active like that, or?
You can actively dredge out the larger materials that are deposited in the upper reaches of the reservoirs and truck them around and place them below the dams. So we've been involved in, this is Placer County Water Agency on the American River, the Middle Fork American River, and the Rubicon River. We have been doing this pilot project for 10 years now, and we have proven that there's no deleterious effects to the environment from it. It's no longer a pilot project, it's now being used by other utilities. And in that same vein, you re-operate the gates of the reservoir so that at high flows, you're not slowing down the flow and the fines keep on moving. So it's a combination of that. And also, we start, here's your pre-existing dam, you build another one upstream, and it's a little bit taller, and you put a slanted screen on the top that has a very fine 1 millimeter mesh on it, so water falls through it into a chamber that collects the water and pipes it elsewhere, but the sediment and the fish go over it, and you don't have the same kind of entrapment. So trying to make our infrastructure, our water infrastructure, more transparent to the movement of sediment is something that is an exciting new frontier for managing human needs in our environment.
Yeah, I was in no way being gloomy. I was just saying.
Well, it is gloomy.
Yeah, but I mean, it's opportunity. It's opportunity, right? I mean, we're living in the system that is not that old. Like, we've built the system in the last 150 years, so it doesn't mean it has to stay that way. Right. So the classic professorial move, right? Like, here's the two things, right? Here it is. Here is the native soil or clay sediment that I just picked up from down the hill, and here's the redder, sandier material that came down the hill. You can feel it, you can touch it, you can all grab some from me or otherwise. Very different materials, contrasting, right? Very contrasting materials. That's part of the theme of today, right? This big sandy slug of this stuff, and I'm getting everybody's faces, sorry, and comparing that to what we're gonna see. I wasn't able, there's been a lot of discovery on this tour for me, ownerships, things like that. So being a local person here has been very useful, right? I have lots of people that I grew up with that I didn't know were rice farmers, that I didn't know were orchardists. I do know now. And so I was asking around. We came out, we secured this site through John. I wasn't having any luck on the downstream stuff. And I ran into a guy that I grew up with, Matt Tennis. His family grows rice. And he's like, why don't you ask the Sonries, right? Saw him at Costco on Sunday night. I called Sonries Farm, where we're gonna go to today, and I was hooked up within minutes, right, with someone that's gonna let us have a pit on their property that's right in the middle of this. One of my students hunts out here, right? So I guess the take-home message is, it's okay to be chatty. Right? It's okay to ingratiate yourself to others because opportunity is there. And this is for the students, you know, for everyone, right? It's okay to be friendly. It's okay to talk to people about what you do and why it matters and why it's interesting, right? Because you never know when you're going to get access. And that's where we get to have stuff like this. Right? It is. It is. Right? And we're here today because of a lot of connections and access. So check out the clay stuff if you want. Check out the sandy stuff, and let's go look at a backhoe pit. Sure. Got me.
So is there any topographical kind of influence or like a situation in which the relief is more likely to cause that hard pan?
Well, I think we should all agree in this car not to say hard pan.
Okay.
But I'm just being pedantic, I guess. Just like in Sonora, I made them all vow not to say serpentine. But anyways, yeah, I mean, right, so silica and then other things in solution are typically, they're following gradients.
Yeah.
And the durapans that I'm familiar with are either associated with stability, you know, so you have a surface that's relatively flat and not experiencing a lot of erosion. And just the natural wetting front, like Andrew said, you got 12 inches of precip, say, in Madera and Fresno County, central San Joaquin Valley.
Yeah.
The depth of wetting, it turns out to be about 18 inches, and that's right around where your durapan is, and where you have actually an abrupt increase of clay sitting on top of that, a nice argillic horizon. And you know, there's feedback too. So you know, anything that starts perching water, the argillic happens first, and that's slowing the wetting front. Or if you know start developing this durapan, that's slowing down the translocation of everything. And there's this other really neat process that happens in Mediterranean climates, I think especially, where you have this drastic like bust and boom with moisture, where you got lots and lots of moisture, saturated conditions, and then it's completely dry. Where you get, when you're saturated, you start to get the reduction of manganese and then iron. And reduced iron, the sort of cycling between reduced and oxidized iron actually generates quite a bit of acidity. Okay, so you get this thing called ferrolysis, kind of a neat process. I know Randy Southard likes to talk about this.
Place, so to speak, right?
Well, it's almost like clay destruction and formation at that point where water's getting hung up, or you get if you get enough days without oxygen, you get cycling between reduced and oxidized iron. You make all this extra acidity, you destroy, you say you're making smectite, you destroy smectite, and all of a sudden you have gibbsite and kaolinite, and probably not so much kaolinite, probably more gibbsite and then some of the iron oxides. But when that happens, you start chewing up that argillic horizon and like almost concentrating it, making it more of an abrupt feature.
So that's how you envision the abruptic in San Joaquin?
Yeah, that's my little story. But yeah, I suspect if you've got a bit more of you know, a slope, a little bit more of a hill situation going on, you're probably going to have
flow.
Yeah, you've got more lateral flow. That iron's being exported from the system. Maybe less of the ferrolysis going on. So that's, I guess, the kind of answer to the topography. There was a cement company that operated in Calaveras County. There's these just really great seams of marble and limestone there, and probably 100 years ago they realized that we could make some great cement, and they crushed it up 24 hours a day and did whatever they do with it. But they made a lot of dust, and several times when we were out working in the area that was downwind from this plant, we would find these white horizons at the top.
Wow.
You know, sometimes like an inch or 3 inches of white, and we thought, what in the world is that? And the pH on the soils there was surprisingly high. Most of the pH, I mean the pH on the serpentinitic soils that we were working on there is a little bit higher than the metavolcanic rocks adjacent to it, but it was a lot higher. And there were oak trees growing on it, and you never see blue oaks growing on serpentinite down there. And they were making it, and I think it was 70 years of fertilizer, of calcium fertilizer, deposited on top of these things. It was
dominant.
Yeah, it was such an interesting little find there. we talked with one of the landowners who gave us permission to get in there, and they said that if you forgot to close your windows in the morning when they really ramped up production, that by the end of the day you'd have white dust just on everything in your house. It permeated the. Yeah, it didn't sound like fun. So I guess it is possible to counteract the magnesium signature there in those serpentinite soils, but it takes a little bit of work.
I've heard it said that the serpentine in the Sierra is not as out of balance as the serpentine in the Coast Range, and hypothesized that just dust from the valley neutralizing the chemistry in the Sierra versus the Coast Range and the prevailing winds.
I could see that, but you know what? When I say serpentinite, you say serpentinite. The chemical composition could be like night and day. You know,
the degree of serpentinization is very variable.
and the imbalance of magnesium relative to calcium. I mean, there was a paper that one of Randy's students did years ago, Donald McGahan. Did you know him?
Know the name.
Well, everyone called him Dig, but Donald is his name.
It's a good name for a soil scientist.
He wrote a great paper on the composition of serpentinite from places all around the state. I think it had about 12 sites. Surprising differences. I mean, he looked at the chemistry, and then he did some germination trials. He planted different seeds and watered them and watched what happened. And, yeah, really interesting stuff. And
that's the Cherokee Strip there on the horizon at the edge of these rice fields, and I think that's where the pit is going to be in there, and then the orchards are probably on the other side of a confined structure to retain the sediments.
so does this come in through canals or water, or where do they?
Yeah, this is probably coming out of Thermalito, that afterbay there.
Oh.
So the Western Canal comes over here.
It's the whole reason for the afterbay is to warm the water up to make it more fit for rice farming.
I was wondering what that was for.
And apparently it doesn't warm to the temperature that they agreed, and like they're continuously suing them because the water is 2 degrees colder than they want it to be or something.
Water rights around here.
Yeah.
Glad I'm not part of that business.
Are you from Chico?
No, but I've worked on farms that
Water's for fighting.
deal with water rights.
Yeah.
So this looks like some of the Cherokee mines. So that's the Cherokee Strip there on the horizon at the edge of these rice fields, and I think that's where the pit is going to be in there, and then the orchards are probably on the other side of a confined structure to retain the sediments.
So does this come in through canals or water, or where do they?
Yeah, this is probably coming out of Thermalito, that afterbay there.
Oh.
So the Western Canal comes over here.
It's the whole reason for the afterbay is to warm the water up to make it more fit for rice farming.
I was wondering what that was for.
And apparently it doesn't warm to the temperature that they agreed, and like they're continuously suing them because the water is 2 degrees colder than they want it to be or something.
Water rights around here.
Yeah.
Glad I'm not part of that business.
So this looks like some of the Cherokee mines.
So this was the one of the only benefits of organizing was I got to go first. Right? I don't have much to say here. I'm gonna leave. All I'm gonna say is that there's a bunch of sediment burying a clay soil. Right? I want you all to get in there and check it out yourself. I don't really have much more to say, honestly. Like, I didn't map this area. I don't know. There's people here that did map it. This is the same stuff, right?
Where did the clay come from?
Okay, I mentioned that earlier, kind of. So this is the same stuff, right? We drove out of the last site. We drove down 149. We saw almonds on the left, and we saw back up into where we were, right? Came out. We saw the almonds on the left. They are almonds. On the right, we saw the sand mine. I would guess, Rich said, Dr. Rosekrantz said, well, I'm surprised there's not nuts all the way up here. I would guess they've just been mining up there, and I don't know when the nuts went in. I know that there's been nuts on the tract on 99 as long as I can remember, but it probably just was a historic land use. They were mining upstream, right downstream where they weren't mining. Hey, this stuff is the right texture. We got irrigation. We got these magical substances that make things grow fast and vigorous, fertilizers, and they started growing nuts. The stuff, if you look at the map and the guide, we came up, we went over the big interchange. You got this beautiful vista, right? That's a beautiful interchange. Both of those, the 149-70 and that one got built about the same time. Down at Highway 70, 149, people were dying every year. There was a left-hand turn, people were crossing the highway, people were dying. It wasn't a good spot. So they built that big space-age beautiful interchange. Same with the one here at 99 and 149. We came over that thing, beautiful vista, we could see everything. And then you crossed where Dry Creek is now. Dry Creek is pushed to the north. That's even where we were back there. They had levied it and pushed it to the north to put it where it was cutting through that material. Then it turns and makes a hard bank. You drive across that orchard. That's the stuff, right? That's the weird thing. You're in all these rice soils. You're driving up from Gridley, all these strath terraces and shallow soils with indurated features. And then there's this inset orchard, right? And that's what we drove across. It turns, and now it heads out a few more miles that way, and it starts to tongue out into the basin. And here, obviously, it's only thick enough to cover up the basin clay that would have been here naturally. How did the basin clays get here? I'll throw out my very cartoonish version, right? Whenever it happened, because I don't know about historical geology, whenever the Sutter Buttes rose up out of the valley, and this river that did not form the valley but is inhabiting it currently, that's totally true. It got pushed to the west as well, right? It goes around the west side of that. Part of that had to do with this big drainage pushing a bunch of sediment out into the valley, keeping it over there too, right? The Feather River pushing stuff, it wasn't able to come this way because the feather was pushing it out, or the proto-feather. So it goes out to the west, and it creates this giant backwater stilling environment that big high flows and materials can pond up, right? The idea of a clay is that it's a colloidal thing that's charged, and under natural conditions it will stay suspended, right? So still water, variable salinity conditions allow these clays to sediment out or flocculate out and fall out of the water column. Over time, that stuff happens. The other really interesting aside, we didn't get to go see the Anita, is this idea of volcanic ash inputs, and the idea that there's been a lot of volcanic activity over the last, give me more than 10,000, 50,000, whatever we want to talk about. With Mount Mazama being a big marker on the landscape, there's been ash coming out of Lassen, there's been eruptions, Lassen just in 1913, right? So the idea that some of these volcanic ashes, which have the right chemical composition to help promote some of these mineral formations, might have been a piece of the story too. That's my totally uneducated version of it, just what I know or what I think. And I don't know if that's all true or not, and I'll let you all talk about that and either vigorously support or refute or in between. So that's what I got.
I just want to make a point. I don't know if anybody really talked about the map yet. I mean, the colored map that Andrew basically made. Did you guys talk about this morning already? Because we're down here at the end on. Actually, I think are we at 5 or 6?
We're close to 6.
Okay, we're at 6.
Map got built.
And the
original plan was we were gonna go over there, but then this came up open.
56.
So this is a little bit. 6 basically to your right on the picture is this location.
Yeah.
We're
So
gonna stop it where 6 was on our way around. So.
And Andrew had me color the Cherokee mine hydraulic mine spoils from dark, which is the higher energy at the top. That's why it says, hydraulic mine sediments in dark blue, and then as it goes all the way down, it just gets lower energy. So it gets finer and finer, and this is just, now we're in the sandier stuff. That's probably why there's the nut growing here.
That's what I mean. I think that it probably was historically, they've been mining that site where we just wrapped for a long time.
Well, that was more gravelly because it's higher energy up there.
That too, and that feature, that geographic feature that kind of entrained it. And then they weren't mining it downstream probably. It was a different landowner.
Well, there's no gravel here.
I don't know.
Sandy.
I wasn't listening to Hannah. I didn't get to hear all of Hannah's talk. But I know she talked about the mine a bit, right? The idea that they found diamonds there, that's still a mystery. But the people that were the diamond miners at Cherokee went directly to South Africa, and they basically formed De Beers mining cartel. So all the connection of diamond mining from South African diamond mining is connected directly to Butte County through that. right? And supposedly some of the De Beers family still owns some of the land upstream. They still own that where they're growing. I wasn't able to get in contact with them. But there's still some connection from the original mining and some of the original land holdings and De Beers, which is, I guess, now not as big of a deal as a corporation. We have an anthropologist on campus who does a lot of documentary work on, he's working with rubies now, but he knows about diamonds and doing videos about diamonds and rubies. So I guess De Beers isn't what it once was as a diamond corporation or diamond miner, but that's connected directly to this whole story.
So the clay settled out or developed in place or both?
Both, I think. I mean, obviously, there's a bunch of settling clay, but then if these ashes, the model we're using, so we didn't see the Anita, the idea that these Anitas, these inset vertisols in the alluvial or in the vernal pool surfaces are partially formed from ashes blowing around and settling in these spots, and the ash, just like with andic properties and andisols, these ashes are of the right particle size and pore crystallinity and right chemistry to weather directly into soil solutions that promote the formation of these short-range order minerals. And right after that stage on mineral development are the smectites. And it's crazy how these more 2-to-1 crystalline materials form first, and then they weather out obviously to more stable materials like kaolinite and the oxides of aluminum and iron. So I think that's part of it. I don't know for sure. Like I said, this is, I should put this back in my pocket, right? So I can make sure my both hands are moving at all times. So
Garrett, the Butte Sink is right over here. It's right over here, and when the Sacramento River used to flood, tremendous amounts of water used to come down there, and the streams off of the mountains here had no place to go because the Sacramento River was full, and so they would come down here and flood these areas, and I think that was part of it also, is that tremendous amounts of clay would settle out then when these were areas.
Just on physical principle, it had to be a big backwater place that was still, some stuff could happen, right? It wasn't flowing, vigorously flowing water because the clays would stay through turbulence of, water column kind of stuff. They would stay suspended. So however the source was, it turned in, the buttes pushed up and created something that plugged up the valley hydrologically in a way that allowed the water to not flow as rapidly through, or through the center, or in size, or whatever, those types of things. At least that's my 2 cents. What do you think, Andrew?
Let me say something about the basins. This is the Butte Basin. We're on the northeast part of the Butte Basin. Then there's the Calusa Basin, the Sutter Basin, the American Basin, the Yolo Basin. Those are these huge places where high flow, low energy deposits accumulated, so that with the banana belt storms coming, this is where that extra water went in a low energy environment. And the engineers that designed the flood control of Sacramento Valley understood about the horizontal hurricanes, and it wasn't going to be a Mississippi style flood control, and that's why they made the bypasses, was to replace the amount of space that these basins were used for flood waters naturally. Big water comes through here like last year.
Aside of that, I was having a conversation with someone else this week, and have you all heard about the floodplain Nigiri fish project, right? Yeah. So we are really actually very fortunate in California that we do have these bypasses. They were in some ways visionary, not to just put clad armored levees on the Sac River everywhere, and they created these leftover spots that would allow this flood water to come in. And there's a lot of hope that those bypass systems are really how our andronomatous salmon-ish fish, can't say it, anadromous, thank you, that those things that go out to the ocean and come back that we like to smoke and eat, and they're delicious and they're important for a lot of reasons, that they're going to manage those flood basins actively as a rearing habitat for these fish, right? Because that's what would happen in the system naturally, that this big valley that would flood every year essentially created big, all kinds of microtopography and channels that would allow these fish to go and live off of all the litter and stuff that was falling in. I would say dead salmon, bear poop, everything you could think of that was there that created a nutrient-rich environment. We obviously, through reclamation, take that stuff and turn it into prime soil, right? But that's part of this whole story. Right when I got digging into the pit, the interface between the existing surface, the basin clay, and the overburdened material, however you want to call it, there's a nice red layer there of iron that's been oxidized recently, but it had been reduced at some point to allow it to move to that location and concentrate into some feature, right? Obvious evidence that there's seasonal saturation, right? There's enough water there long enough that all the oxygen to a certain level is removed from the water column, allowing iron to be used in a secondary way to be reduced. Reduced iron moves around in the soil and oxidized iron doesn't, right? This is a really significant indicator of function and regulatory things of a lot of different stripes, right? So both Joel, and this ties directly into the vernal pool discussion in many, many ways. Hydric soil indicators, things like that as a regulatory thing. And then I'm going to block off the top of the hill.
There's nothing, it would take forever to really talk about redox features. First, reduction oxidation. It's an abbreviation of reduction oxidation. Second, what your first challenge is if you're trying to make a regulatory determination of whether it's a jurisdictional wetland or not is, are those active features or are they relic features? And that's a very difficult determination. Second, there's a dimension to it. If they're not within the upper part of the profile, and I'll use that very generally, it's probably not a wetland. In fact, if they're buried, as Garrett just mentioned, there's something else going on. They could be dynamic and active, but they're not due to the profile being a wetland. A wetland is a jurisdictional determination. I mean, I want Joel actually to discuss. Joel has a really good feeling for some of the redox features, but my point simply is that making a determination on age of a feature in the soil is very difficult. Some features, like segregated iron, they weather very slowly. They don't disappear. They're indelible in that sense. There are keys to that weathering process that allow you to determine whether or not it's an active feature or a relic feature. Relic meaning something that took place in the past and is no longer happening, at least at the rate that it was happening when it was formed. So we've got some real heavy-handed discussions you need to have about redoxomorphic features. You've got even heavier discussions you've got to have with a regulator, meaning Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife Service, Fish and Wildlife Department at the state, whomever. You've got to have these discussions with them about whether or not this is even something we should be discussing in terms of, is this a jurisdictional wetland? Because when they see those regulators who are trained or not trained, they see them and they don't really try to make that determination, is it active or not? They say, well, it's in the manual, it says the 1987 manual, says you've got redoxomorphic features and therefore it fits the soil criteria for active wetland, okay, or jurisdictional wetland. Joel, maybe you want to take it from there.
Well, just to embellish a little bit, in terms of the formation, it looks to me like the redox starts at about 30 inches or so, and I suspect maybe what's happening is there's the perch water table that's formed over the basin clay, and that's where you see enough of where it's saturated is where the redox forms. It looks like it's redox concentrations, maybe also redox depletions. But from a regulatory standpoint, in the field indicators of hydric soils in the United States, most of the indicators, if not all, have to begin within 12 inches of the surface. So this is going to be way too deep to even come close to meeting any of the criteria, even if it did have the right colors to it.
On that point, right, using taxonomy, inside of taxonomy, these things are built in through color often, right? Looking at oxidized features and the reduced matrix or things like that. And a lot of these are built as contrasting color features and depending on certain number of chips and certain directions and things like that. And that's all I'll say about that. But that's where your eye and using diagnostic features is a very powerful tool, right? You're going into a pit not just to look for horizons, but look for other things that are accumulating or being moved around as indicators of process, which is really cool. And that's why ultimately, if you know it or not, young people and more senior members of the crowd, that's why we study this stuff, right? It's really interesting and fun and dynamic, and we dig holes because we have no idea what we're gonna find, right? And it's always fun, it's exciting. Like, I walked up on this pit, I was walking fast, I was so excited to come see it because I had no idea. I thought maybe the veneer was going to be a little thicker, but it wasn't, and that's fine, right? It's way more interesting than I even thought it would be. So
Yeah, if I could
keep
add
your wonder up is all I'm trying to say.
Let me add to that. There are things that knowing what a redoxomorphic feature is and looks like, what color it is and all that, they're very useful. If you're actually with an auger in the field, and I don't care, by the way, whether it's a displaced soil feature, meaning some places that has had soil added, moved from somewhere else and added to it to form a landform of some sort, whether it's a basement, a pediment for a building or something like that. If you start finding redoxomorphic features, you can predict that your next auger bucket is going to hit a different layer. And when you do that, you're starting to talk about different either landscape or stratification in that emplacement process. So you can actually use these features that we're talking about that are used in a very, very narrow sense for a jurisdictional issue. It's part of what's going on. That's what you have to get to, is that if you find those, it's not just, oh, it's wetland or not. It's telling us something about this is what you would call a buried paleosol. And the indication, if I were digging right where the Cal Poly Mustang is standing, right there, with an auger, I'd be going down, 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 and I'd hit at about, 3.5 feet. I'd hit redoxomorphic concentrations of some sort, and whatever I find. And I'd say, oh, something's going to change here. First, you've got more moisture there, and the reason you've got more moisture is because you've got a restriction below it. That may or may not be an old landform, that is the old land surface, but in this case, I think it's unquestionably a buried paleosol, right, Roy? I mean, that's where this is one of the first indications that if you want to understand a landscape and the stratification in that landscape, you're looking for features just like that, okay? You might actually hit organic features down there. You might hit compaction, you might hit structure down there that you haven't been seeing, okay? But all of that, it's not just, you don't waste your time by learning about soil morphology, and color. Yesterday we had a whole symposium on a bunch of stuff, but soil color came in. What an exciting thing to talk about is color. I mean, there's nothing that you perceive better than color. Look at just the jacket colors around here. Look at eye colors. Look at skin color. Your first perception of a landscape is color. How many shades of green are there? How many shades of gray this time of year? Where are the blossoms? You're not looking for blossoms, you're looking for that pink color in those blossoms. If you understand your perception of color is one of your most accurate perceptions, all of a sudden you've got a different way to look at that whole landscape, okay? And it goes from the extensive part I just talked about to the intensive part that we're talking about now, okay? And I'm staying on the highest point, so we're in good shape, okay? Maybe you want to add to that.
And that's color at 5 miles an hour,
right.
At 55 miles an hour,
yeah.
And from 50,000 feet, right? I mean, color in both this direction as you see it, and aerial, different types of remote sensing images that allow you to see patterns across the landscape and things that are similar and things that are not, right? So,
like Dylan's maps.
Yes.
Yesterday.
Well, not mine. I mean, I didn't make
or
those.
whoever.
Scaling back out.
That's 100 years of hard work.
Right.
But, actually, since I'm now the focus of attention.
Take the stage, buddy.
One of my favorite things to relate to 4th, 5th, and 6th graders is that soil science is a lot of fun because it's one of the few disciplines that you can use your eyes and your hands and your taste and smell and whatever to do very quantitative work. And most kids think that science is done in laboratories. They think it's done with machines, but I think it's pretty amazing. Yeah, and I think little kids think it's interesting that you can do very interesting science with your hands and your eyes. That seems to really click with people.
You never grow up. You're still digging in it.
Yeah, we're still doing it, right?
Yeah,
If I could add just one little sentence to that. What you do when you take a Munsell soil color book and look for a color is you're calibrating what you've already seen in the field. You're calibrating your eye to what's there. And you're saying, oh, well, it's here in this one little ped. And wait, over there's a layer of it. Okay, so you're actually, these tools we use are calibrating our own senses to figure out what's going on there. And it's a critical part. And in fact, you could throw all your books away and get a pretty good calibration of where the colors are in that side of that pit or across this landscape or on your neighbor's tattoos. Okay. So I think it's very important to recognize that we are the science. It's not the books and the tools and the maps. We are the scientists. We're making that stuff. We're making that stuff happen. And we're just using these other things as tools to help us out. the soil survey reports are tools. The soil web maps are tools. We're the users of those tools. And I'm talking to the kids. I'm not talking to the old farts. Okay.
Okay. This was not an intentional segue, but Terry wants to talk. Sorry, Terry.
Actually, if this, there's really, it's a fascinating subject, at least for me, and I was part of a research project that was in Texas, California, and India. And it's on the clay portion here. And if you can't see it over here, but if you're careful when you're digging out in the clay, and I'm sure Dave and some of the other experienced soil scientists have done this, not just digging with a big thing, but a big tool, but really carefully. If you look right here, you'll see multiple shear zones. And you can, I did a project, I was telling a couple of kids here, I forget your names, but in Texas we had about a 60-foot trench. It's called Gilgai. If the clay was on the surface, it forms actually a little bit of a bowl from a micro mound to a micro inner mound, micro mound. And in Texas, it wet dries, so it shrinks and swells more often. And so it forms these shear zones, master shear zones, and it forms a bowl. And you can actually pick out, and if you had time, you could actually pick out the entire bowl. And if you get on this side and take a look or something and be careful, you can actually see these shear zones coming down right here, I picked a few of them out, and actually, if you let me have time, I could pick out a whole thing maybe this big.
Is that the next wave of monoliths is going to be bowl art?
Yeah.
Actually,
we had a trench, and what we did is the mound, the transitional part, the inner mound, and on up to the next mound. We had about 6 profiles, 50 centimeters wide, and in vertisols, they're not horizontal horizons. They're polygons and wedges and whatever. And so we sampled all of the profiles, every different part, and then those polygons that were missed, we sampled those also. What we did is we took golf, what do you call it? Golf things that you stick in. Anyway, we pegged all the entire layers. We put string up like fishnet so you could stand back and look at the whole thing. We took from the high mound to the high mound and put a string across. That was our baseline. We measured every 50 centimeters. We transferred that to a graph paper, put it all on GIS, and then all of the lab data you could say, where's the 10YR52 colors or whatever. In Texas, there was a calcareous substratum about 6 feet down. Because of the shrink swell pulling this stuff up, the mound was a chimney. Colors were like 10YR52 and calcareous. You could actually see the chimney pulled up. The inner mound was 10YR31 and pH of 6, no carbonates. And it was just fantastic. You could do anything. Where's the pH? Where's the organic carbon? Where's whatever the clay content?
That was original baseline for digital mapping.
Yeah. So we did 2 pits in Texas. We did 2 pits in California. One west of the Colusa in the basin, and one up on the hills about a 20 or 30% slope. Actually, you find the same thing up there. And the Texas guy said there's no vertisols on anything more than 9%. And we said, well, come out, I'll show you. So we showed him Diablo. Anyway, you could actually, there's a Johann Baume is a world-renowned hydrologist, and he said you have to rethink the hydrology of vertisols. they not normally come down like a normal, quote, normal soil. They'll hit these shear zones and go this way and not that way. So there's a lot of work that really needs to be done on vertisols. It's really interesting if you really want to, I mean, you think that's fake, but it's not fake. That shear zone is there year after year. And there's multiple layers of those. To me, it's really, I mean, if you took time, you could pick out the whole thing.
And all because the inner layer of those clays can hydrate and dehydrate, right? Because
And
they're swelling up and they're creating pressures, and then they're doing that year after year, and they're creating bigger features that are pressure.
And those who don't know about coefficient of lineal extensibility, the movement of soils in a 60-inch profile, you can move that from dry to wet 6 inches. So, I mean, it moves up and down that much.
And that's why they don't plant trees on it. Right? Perennial plants, it rips their...
And that's why engineers should know, contact soil scientists when they're building houses on slabs and whatever.
$60 million football stadiums in
Right.
Texas.
Anyway,
in Denver.
those of you who missed it, it's right here. I picked it out.
Jerry, is that work available for people to access?
It's published in the Soil Survey Horizons.
Oh,
The paper is, yeah, it's by Hari Israr and Terry Cook.
and I believe that's archived on the web with the Soil Science Society.
Yeah.
Mail it to everybody.
Yeah.
So, once again, I'm the bad guy.
There's some ducks. There's some ducks flying with the cranes. Yeah.
5, maybe 6, 10 inches high here.
Okay.
It'll be maybe 6 or 10 inches lower here.
Okay.
It'll actually be a micro mound, intermound.
Vertisol landscape.
It's the same idea as in like the Arctic tundra where you have these polygonal features.
Right.
It's the same thing, but it's the clay shrinking and swelling instead of the ice.
Yeah, you can.
And you get these like places of like energy sort of.
There's another one. See there? Right there? Right there? There's one there. There's one there. There's one there. These are massive shear zones that go, it'll go all the way up. If it were on the surface, you know, it'll go to the top of the clay here. It's really incredible.
Would you have wedge-shaped aggregates in here too? Or
Yeah, between here.
This is the face of an aggregate?
This is the face right here.
Okay.
Well, you do it long enough, and it's like you get these points of equilibrium where you have a definite bottom and a definite top.
That's where you get these wedge
Fabric,
shaped.
they're like waves on the ocean.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
These,
but in
these
slow
wedge
motion.
shaped.
Wedge-shaped aggregates
Mm-hmm.
in here?
That.
And you can.
There. Oh no, that's a knife. You did that. You made one.
But
I was
you
picking
just
there. You can pick off.
pick
I picked
this.
off an area like this.
Oh,
in
look,
one of
there's
my-
a rock.
Let's email the
That's
article to
interesting.
everybody who was here. It'd be good reading.
This is one of the edges. Obviously, this is high value land because they got water and it's got the right texture. As you drove up, we drove across Nelson Ship. We got up, we were already on the material. But as you noticed, right, we were driving above the basin the whole way, right? Because they piled this material up. They managed it, they levied it, and they probably were helping it slosh around so it could pile up because they had a waste management issue, right? They were trying to get rid of material that they didn't want piling up in certain spots. So they had it run. It runs 2 or 3, 4 more miles down, right? It just keeps going way down all the way to Lombard. So super cool stuff. So what, you're making some clay models over here? Is there anything going on?
Oh yeah, what do you want?
Relieving stress.
Good. It's like those things that have little red eyes.
Therapeutic, huh?
So,
Yeah, it's therapeutic.
if you didn't get some clay in your hands, get some clay in your hands. This is not the right time to throw pots with though, right? They don't use smectites for that. They use kaolinites, right? Because of the chemical nature of the one-to-one clays, and when you fire them, they work the way you want. This stuff doesn't work so good for that kind of stuff. I don't know what else to say. I think overall, I hope you guys all had a really great day. You know, it was fantastic. For those of you that aren't going to dinner, you know, sorry, but we still have dinner tonight. It's at Roots Catering. I think if you don't know please let me know. You have helped me, do something that I've wanted to do for a long time. It was to see this and do this. It's been really a great day for me. Hopefully this is not the last time that we'll be seeing these landscapes. Hopefully there'll be a lot more of this. Thank you to everyone that helped, right? Everybody that helped do stuff, food, drinks, maps, everything you could think of. Andrew, Dean, everybody that was a part of the mapping here. All of you for coming out, right? And you know what? You can throw shade on all the fools that didn't come, right? There's people that said they were gonna come and didn't. Sorry if they got snowed in, that's, but they didn't show up and you all did, right? So when you could tell them, hey, you missed out, right? Never lose that opportunity to shade your friends that didn't show up, right? It's important. Maybe next time they'll show up, right? Anyone else? Last comments?
Yeah.
Please.
From PSSAC to Garrett Lyles. Yes. Thank you, man.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much.
Not the last one. Not the last tour. I'm not going to do one next year probably, but a year from that.
Good.
I'll be on in 2 years from now. We'll do another one. We're going to do West Side next time. We're going to go over to the West Side for sure. Butte County, just in general, the students that are here know, if you want to come look at all the wild and wonderful aspects of soil in a very tight package, it's right here, right? We have all the parent materials, we have climatic gradients, we have all kinds of cool things here to come see, and hopefully across the time that I'm here, you can all come look at those with me and with each other. So that's all I got. Yeah.
Cool.
And check out this is one of the, kind of towards the distal end of this, the Cherokee hydraulic mine tailings, right? Across
Same
the
stuff we just saw.
But it's
yeah.
a lot finer.
Well, I mean, we were literally just right across the strip from here where we were at.
This is like a silt loam or
Okay.
a fine sandy loam.
Out of the high energy corridor.
We're out of the high energy corridor into the low energy.
Well, I think more this way, high energy, low energy, not necessarily this way. Because we were literally we were a quarter mile that way at the pit. We were right over there. We weren't that far north-south. We were literally right over there. So it could have been, more of that energy across the lateral energy where they were keeping the creek there, and that's the creek, and they've kept it there, and it's sandier than over here, but I don't know. And that will be later stories and other things that'll come out of that. So, okay, that's 5 minutes.